Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The Persistent Stranger. One day, when I was 19, I decided to go thrifting. It was a rare day with no work, no class, and beautiful weather. I drove a few towns over to a store in a rural area where I'd always had good luck finding things. I was looking for cheap frames to create a gallery wall in my bedroom. I was on the phone with my mom as I wandered through the store. As I approached the frame aisle, I noticed a man, maybe in his 30s or 40s, standing alone. He wasn't looking at anything, just intensely staring at me with a large, almost comical grin on his face. I wondered how long he had been staring at me. This made me feel uncomfortable. Not wanting to take any chances, I decided to confront him. I looked him in the face and said, "How's it going?" in a tone that I hoped implied I wasn't interested in any weirdness that day. He said nothing, like he didn't even register my presence. He just kept staring as I walked past, still with that bizarre grin. I gathered an armful of frames and began arranging them on the floor. It was a weekday afternoon, and there were very few people in the store, so I didn't feel like I was inconveniencing anyone by spreading out. Still on the phone with my mom, I noticed a shadow fall over me. The man hadn't moved on. He was standing over me, staring and not saying a word. My mom picked that moment to suggest we hang out, but I was at work, so I let it go. I refused to be deterred from my mission, so I glanced at him and continued arranging the frames. But at this point, alarm bells were ringing in my head, and I was getting nervous. I had never had this reaction to a stranger before, so something felt off. Still grinning and staring, he finally spoke. "You're pretty." "Thanks," I replied. "Where do you go to school?" he asked. I was so nervous that I blurted out the truth. There were 14,000 students at my university. I thought to myself, he doesn't know who I am. He would never find me. He didn't say another word and continued to stare, still grinning. My anxiety was getting the best of me, so I gathered the frames and stood up to leave, pretending to answer my phone. I made my way to the checkout, hoping he wouldn't follow me. Thankfully, he didn't. He left. I stood in the longest line, inspecting my purchases, a little impressed that despite my distress, I had made some decent finds. It's important to note that there was a main entrance at the front of the store and a side door at the opposite corner. The parking lot was L-shaped, surrounding both exits. My car was parked in the corner between the two exits. From any point in the store, you couldn't see my car. I let my gaze drift over to the side exit, where I saw the man walking through the parking lot. There he goes weird, I thought. As he walked, he was staring at me through the door. A minute later, I saw him pass by the front entrance, which made no sense because there was no exit to the road from that direction. Maybe his car is parked over that way, I thought. He was still staring at me. Another minute passed, and he reversed course, meandering back past the front entrance, then past the side entrance again. The whole time, he maintained eye contact with me as I waited inside the store. It dawned on me that he was covering the exits and possibly knew where my car was. But how would he know it's my car? I thought. Then it hit me, because I had told him which school I attended, and my bright yellow school parking pass was hanging on my dashboard. Playing it cool today? Are you, idiot? I thought to myself. Being a cocky 19-year-old meant I didn't often realize when I should be worried. Yet I was petrified when I realized this. I did something I had never done before. Red-faced and flustered, I told the cashier I was scared. She immediately offered to have a male employee walk me to my car. And who should appear before me but a high school friend who I had forgotten worked there. He grabbed my bags and walked me to my car, where the man was standing by the driver's side door. My friend loaded my things into the back seat, having to motion to the guy to get out of the way, and we made small talk while the man stood awkwardly nearby, trying to appear casual. He never said a single word. My friend closed the door behind me, gave the man a pointed look, and he started to wander away. I sped out of there, and in my rearview mirror, I saw the man walking out of the parking lot towards the road. He hadn't even arrived in a car or with anyone. He wasn't waiting for anyone but me. When I left, his business was finished. Or maybe it was foiled. I couldn't stop wondering if his plan was just to continue the awkward small talk until I could extricate myself, or if he wanted to leave in my car, possibly by force. Prey in the pines. The crack of a twig snapping underfoot echoed through the silent forest, the sound amplified in the stillness of the twilight. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. We'd come to these woods seeking a peaceful escape, a chance to reconnect with nature. But in that heart-stopping moment, I knew we'd stumbled into something far more sinister. The hunters had become the hunted, and our fight for survival was about to begin. My name is Maria, and I've always loved the tranquility of the wilderness. When my friend Alex suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the Ozark National Forest, I was eager to escape the city and immerse myself in the beauty of the outdoors. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, meticulously studying maps and choosing a route that would take us far from the well-trodden paths. The first day had been everything we'd hoped for: challenging hikes through pristine forests, breathtaking vistas, and the kind of solitude that rejuvenates the soul. As the sun began to set, we found the perfect campsite, a secluded clearing nestled beside a gently flowing stream. We pitched our tent, built a crackling fire, and settled down to enjoy a simple meal under the canopy of stars. "This is the life," Alex said, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "Just us and nature. No deadlines, no e-mails, no stress." I nodded in agreement, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. The peacefulness of the surroundings was almost magical. We were just about to turn in for the night when we heard voices, carried on the wind, their tone unsettling. Alex tensed beside me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart quickening. "It sounded like poachers," Alex finished grimly. "I'm going to check it out. Stay here." Before I could protest, he vanished into the darkness, our flashlight beam cutting a swathe through the trees. Minutes crawled by, each one an eternity. The voices grew louder, then abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Just as I was about to go after Alex, he burst back into the campsite, his face pale and etched with fear. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." "What? Why? What did you see?" His hands trembled as he hastily packed our gear. "Poachers," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "At least 3 of them. They've got guns, Maria, big ones. And they didn't look like the type to ask questions first." My blood ran cold. Poaching was a problem in these parts, but I'd never thought we'd actually encounter it firsthand. "Did they see you?" Alex shook his head. "I don't think so, but they're close, too close. We need to get out of here." We doused the fire, shouldered our packs, and plunged into the darkness. Alex consulted our GPS. "There's a ranger station about 10 miles north of here," he said. "If we push hard, we can make it by morning." With only the moon to guide us, we set off through the dense forest. Every shadow seemed menacing, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, but the rough terrain and darkness made progress slow. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps and voices behind us. They'd found our campsite, and now they were on our trail. "Run," Alex whispered, grabbing my hand. We fled, adrenaline coursing through our veins. Branches whipped at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. I could hear the men behind us, their voices growing closer, their curses echoing through the trees. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath my feet. Alex and I tumbled down a steep embankment, landing in a heap at the bottom. Pain shot through my ankle. "I think I sprained it," I gasped, leaning heavily on Alex. He looked back up the slope, his expression grim. "We can't outrun them now. We need to hide." He helped me limp to a thicket of dense bushes. We crawled inside, pulling our packs in after us. I bit back a cry as Alex gently examined my ankle. "It's swollen," he whispered, "but I don't think it's broken. We'll need to wrap it when we're safe." The voices were getting closer. I held my breath as flashlight beams swept across the area where we'd fallen. "They've got to be around here somewhere," one of the men growled. "Find them. We can't let them get away." My heart hammered in my chest. Alex's arm tightened around me, and I buried my face in his shoulder, terrified that even my breathing might give us away. The poachers searched for what felt like an eternity, their lights probing every shadow, their voices growing increasingly frustrated. Finally, they moved on, the sound of their footsteps fading into the distance. We waited until we couldn't hear them anymore before daring to move. Alex helped me out of the thicket, his face etched with worry. "We need to keep moving," he said. "They'll be back once it's light." Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, I hobbled along as Alex led the way. We stuck to the thickest undergrowth, using every bit of cover we could find. Every snapping twig, every bird call made us freeze, convinced that we were about to be discovered. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, we heard the poachers again. They were spread out now, systematically searching the area. We were running out of options. "There," Alex whispered, pointing to a rocky outcropping ahead. "If we can make it up there, we might be able to see the ranger station." It was a difficult climb, made even harder by my injured ankle. Alex practically carried me the last few yards. But when we reached the top, the view took my breath away. Miles of unbroken forest stretched out before us, and there, in the distance, was a thin plume of smoke rising above the trees. "That has to be it," I said, hope flickering in my chest. But our relief was short-lived. A shout from below told us we'd been spotted. The poachers were coming, and we were trapped. "We'll have to climb down the other side," Alex said, his voice grim. "It's steep, but it's our only chance." The descent was terrifying. Loose rocks tumbled beneath our feet, and more than once I thought we were going to fall. But somehow we made it to the bottom. We could hear the poachers cursing as they struggled to follow. It bought us some time, but we knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up. The ranger station seemed to get no closer, no matter how fast we moved. My ankle throbbed with pain, each step a searing agony. But the sound of pursuit spurred me on. We burst out of the tree line and into a small clearing. The ranger station stood before us, a simple wooden structure that looked like salvation itself. "Help!" Alex shouted, pounding on the door. "Please, someone help us." For a heart-stopping moment, there was no response. Then the door flew open, revealing a startled park ranger. "What in the—" he began, but Alex cut him off. "Poachers," he gasped. "They're right behind us. They've got guns." The ranger's expression hardened. He ushered us inside and bolted the door, then grabbed a rifle from a rack on the wall. "Stay here," he said, moving to the window. "I've called for backup, but it'll be a while before they get here." The next few minutes were agonizing. We could hear the poachers approaching, their voices raised in anger as they realized where we'd gone. The ranger stood his ground, ordering them to drop their weapons. For a terrifying moment, I thought there would be a shootout, but faced with an armed official, the poachers' nerve broke. They fled back into the forest, just as the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the trees. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and medical attention for my ankle. The poachers were apprehended a few days later, trying to flee the state. Alex and I never did finish our camping trip, but in a way we got more adventure than we'd bargained for. We saw firsthand the dark side of nature, not the animals or the elements, but the human predators who exploit the wilderness for their own gain. We still go camping, but now we're more cautious. We know that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk. But we also know that we're stronger together, that we can face whatever comes our way. And sometimes, when we're sitting around a campfire under a canopy of stars, we remember that night in the Ozarks, not with fear, but with a sense of pride. We survived. We protected each other. And in doing so, we discovered a strength within ourselves that we never knew we had. the hooded figure in the snow. This memory was sparked recently as I've been helping my mom sell my childhood home. It's about possibly the scariest thing that ever happened to me. My friends and I were 15 at the time. I grew up in a subdivision about 20 minutes away from any towns. It was a very safe neighborhood with streetlights, lots of kids, and many of my classmates lived there. We never felt any fear walking to each other's houses or staying out after dark. My subdivision was about 3 miles long, and I lived at the very end of it. The last mile was a sharp right turn into a hill and had thick woods on both sides of the street with 4 houses at the bottom, all surrounded by woods. My friend Madison lived at the entrance of the subdivision. One year, we got about 8 inches of snow and ice, which shut down the roads and closed schools for a week. During the first few days of the snow, Madison, Kelly, and I spent the whole day playing. We decided to have a sleepover at Madison's house that night. As the sun began to set, we started to trek to my house to get my overnight bag. By the time we finished packing, it was dark out. The woods were always enhanced by darkness, but it didn't bother us. The 3 of us started walking, joking, and enjoying the night air. As we cleared the top of the hill, we saw something that made us stop in our tracks. There was a hooded figure standing on the corner, illuminated only by the streetlight. It didn't move. It stood completely stiff, staring straight ahead. It was unsettling, but we thought it could easily be a neighbor. With nervous laughter, we started descending the hill. The figure never moved, just kept staring straight ahead. As we got to the bottom, we could see that the hood was lined with fur, and the person was wearing some kind of black mask, hiding their features. We started to get nervous. We were now directly across from this person. It was dark, with only the streetlight illuminating the corner. After staring at the figure for about 45 seconds, Madison finally called out, "Hey, stop messing with us. It's not funny." At that point, the figure moved, shuffling its feet to turn its body in our direction. It extended its hand towards us. Time seemed to stop. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The figure gestured and said, "Come here," before turning and walking into the woods. We ran as fast as our feet would take us until we reached Madison's house and bolted the door behind us. The next morning, when I walked home, I stopped at the corner where the figure had been and felt pure fear. There were 2 sets of footprints in the snow, one leading out of the woods and one leading back in. The hiker and the graves. The sun beat down on my back as I trekked deeper into the wilderness, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. I'd always found solace in the solitude of nature, a welcome escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But on this particular hike, my peaceful retreat would take a sinister turn, leading me down a path of terror I never could have imagined. My name is Emily, and I'm an avid hiker. There's something about the challenge of conquering a trail, the sense of accomplishment that comes with reaching the summit, that keeps me coming back for more. So when I had a week's vacation, I decided to explore a new trail in the remote reaches of the Appalachian Mountains. The first few days of my hike were idyllic. I followed the winding path, marveling at the towering trees and the vibrant wildflowers that dotted the landscape. I set up camp each night, listening to the symphony of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. On the 4th day, however, the trail grew fainter, the markers less frequent. I consulted my map and GPS, confident in my ability to navigate the rugged terrain. But as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, a sense of unease began to creep over me. It started with a small detail, something that seemed out of place. A patch of disturbed earth, partially hidden by a tangle of fallen leaves. Curiosity piqued, I approached cautiously. As I drew closer, I saw it a shallow grave, the earth freshly turned. My heart pounded in my chest. This was no natural occurrence. This was the work of human hands. Panic threatened to consume me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I scanned the surrounding area, my eyes widening in horror as I spotted more disturbed patches of earth, more graves. This wasn't just one isolated incident. This was a burial ground, a place where someone had been systematically disposing of bodies. The realization sent a wave of fear washing over me. I had to get out of there, contact the authorities. But as I turned to leave, a twig snapped behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. Could have been an animal, I told myself, but deep down I knew better. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. Tall and imposing, he wore camouflage gear and carried a hunting rifle. His face was obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses, but I could see the glint of something cold and calculating in his eyes. Fear pulsed through me, but I knew I couldn't give in to panic. I had to think to find a way out of this. I considered making a run for it, but I knew I wouldn't be able to outrun a bullet. My only hope was to outsmart him. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" I seemed to be lost. The figure didn't move, but I could sense his attention shift towards me. "I'm over here," I continued, my voice trembling slightly. "Could you help me?" He stepped out of the shadows, his rifle held loosely at his side. "Lost, are you?" he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Well, come on out. Let's see if we can get you back on track." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I knew I had no other choice. I stepped out into the clearing, my hands raised in a gesture of surrender. As I approached, I could see his face more clearly. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his late 20s, with a clean-shaven face and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. "What's your name?" he asked, his eyes fixed on me. "Emily," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Well, Emily," he said, "it seems you've stumbled upon something you shouldn't have seen." He gestured towards the graves with his rifle. "These are my projects." My blood ran cold. This was no ordinary hiker. This was a monster, a serial killer who used these woods as his personal hunting ground. "I won't tell anyone," I blurted out, desperation edging into my voice. "I swear, just let me go." He chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed through the trees. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Emily. You've seen too much." He raised his rifle and I knew my time was up. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, a sound pierced the air, the distant barking of a dog. The man's eyes widened in surprise, and he lowered his rifle. "Damn," he muttered. "Looks like I've got company." He turned and ran, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. I didn't hesitate. I took off in the opposite direction, adrenaline lending speed to my feet. I didn't stop running until I reached the main trail. There, I collapsed, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I had escaped, but the memory of those graves, of the man with the cold eyes and the rifle, would forever be etched in my mind. I reported everything to the authorities, but they never found the killer. He vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the grim evidence of his crimes and the lingering fear in the hearts of those who dared to venture into those woods. I still hike, but I'll never forget the day I stumbled upon the graveyard in the wilderness. It was a stark reminder that even in the most beautiful and serene places, darkness can lurk, and that the monsters we fear most are often not the creatures of myth and legend, but the ones who walk among us, hidden in plain sight. The mysterious house. This story is about a mysterious house that I once lived in. It was a beautiful old Victorian house, with a large wraparound porch and a grand staircase. I loved it, but it was also haunted. I first noticed the strange things happening around the house when I was a child. I would often hear footsteps in the attic, even though I knew I was the only one home. I would also see shadows moving in the corners of my room at night. As I got older, the hauntings became more frequent and more intense. I would often wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by a cold, dark fog. I would also hear voices whispering my name, and I would see apparitions of people walking through the walls. I tried to ignore the hauntings, but they eventually became too much to bear. I decided to move out of the house, but I never forgot the strange things that happened there. Trapped in the office complex, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the deserted hallways of the Zenith office complex. It was another Friday night, and I was the only one left, working late to finish a presentation. Little did I know that this dedication to my job would soon have me fighting for my life, trapped in a concrete jungle with nowhere to run. My name is Alex, and I'm a junior marketing analyst at Zenith Industries. I'm not exactly a workaholic, but I do take pride in my job, and this particular project was important to me. So, I found myself alone in the office on a Friday night, determined to get it done. Around 11 p.m., I decided to take a break and grab a coffee from the break room. As I walked down the deserted hallway, I noticed a light on in one of the conference rooms. Curious, I peeked through the glass door. What I saw made my blood run cold. 3 men, dressed in dark clothing and wearing ski masks, were rummaging through the cabinets and drawers, tossing files and papers onto the floor. Burglars. My heart pounded in my chest as I quietly backed away. I had to call the police, but my phone was at my desk, on the other side of the office. I considered running for the fire escape, but I quickly realized that would leave me trapped outside with nowhere to go. I needed a plan, and fast. Thinking quickly, I ducked into the nearest office and locked the door behind me. I could hear the burglars moving through the hallway, their voices muffled but distinct. They were getting closer. I scanned the room, desperate for a hiding spot or a weapon. There was nothing but a desk, a chair, and a filing cabinet. Wait, the filing cabinet. I quickly squeezed myself into the bottom drawer, pulling it closed just as I heard the doorknob rattle. The burglars entered the office, their flashlights dancing across the walls. "Anything here?" One of them growled. "Doesn't look like it," another replied. "Let's move on." I held my breath, praying they wouldn't decide to check the filing cabinet. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Finally, I heard them leave the office and continue down the hallway. I waited a few more minutes, just to be safe, before cautiously pulling the drawer open. The office was empty. I crept out, my heart still pounding, and made my way back to my desk. As I reached for my phone, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around to see one of the burglars standing in the doorway, a crowbar glinting in his hand. Well, he sneered. "Looks like we have a little bonus." I knew I was in trouble. I was cornered with no way out. Or was there? I glanced around the office, my eyes falling on the large window overlooking the city. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. Before the burglar could react, I lunged for the window. I threw it open and climbed onto the narrow ledge, my heart pounding in my ears. The ground was 5 stories below. "Get back here," the burglar shouted, rushing towards me. I didn't hesitate. I took a deep breath and jumped. The wind whipped past my face as I plummeted towards the ground. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But instead of hitting concrete, I landed with a thud on the awning of the coffee shop below. The awning sagged under my weight, but it held. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and looked back up at the office window. The burglar was staring down at me, his face contorted with rage. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I jumped from the awning to the ground and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of a crowded street, my heart still pounding in my chest. I called the police from a nearby payphone, and they quickly apprehended the burglars. As it turned out, they were part of a larger organized crime ring, and the files they were after contained sensitive information that could have exposed their operation. I was hailed as a hero by the local media, but I didn't feel like one. I felt lucky to be alive, and I learned a valuable lesson that night. Never underestimate the importance of a good escape route. The haunting of the old Victorian house. I was a young girl when my family moved into an old Victorian house in a small town. The house was beautiful, with a large wraparound porch and a grand staircase. I loved it, but I soon realized that it was also haunted. The first strange thing that happened was that I would often hear footsteps in the attic, even though I knew I was the only one home. I would also see shadows moving in the corners of my room at night. As I got older, the hauntings became more frequent and more intense. I would often wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by a cold, dark fog. I would also hear voices whispering my name, and I would see apparitions of people walking through the walls. I tried to ignore the hauntings, but they eventually became too much to bear. I decided to move out of the house, but I never forgot the strange things that happened there. The hauntings continued even after I moved out. My parents sold the house, but the new owners also reported seeing and hearing strange things. But I believe that the house was built on a Native American burial ground. I also believe that the house was once the site of a tragic event, such as a murder or a suicide. I will never forget the experience of living in a haunted house. It was a terrifying and unsettling experience, but it was also a fascinating one. I learned a lot about the supernatural, and I will always be grateful for the opportunity to have lived in such a unique and historic home. The Masked Ball. The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, the air alive with the murmur of conversation and the lilting strains of a string quartet. Guests, adorned in their finest attire and concealed behind elaborate masks, mingled amongst the opulent decor, their identities a tantalizing mystery. I, too, was swept up in the enchantment of the masquerade ball, until the night took a dark turn, revealing the sinister secrets hidden beneath the veneer of elegance. My name is Isabella, and I've always been drawn to the allure of masked balls. There's something undeniably thrilling about the anonymity, the freedom to be someone else for a night. So when I received an invitation to the prestigious masquerade ball at the van der Luden's estate, I was eager to attend. I chose my attire carefully, a flowing crimson gown, a delicate silver mask adorned with feathers, and a pair of elegant gloves that reached past my elbows. As I stepped into the ballroom, I felt a thrill of excitement. The room was filled with intriguing characters, a mysterious gentleman in a raven mask, a captivating woman with a mask of shimmering peacock feathers, a group of masked figures who moved with an almost unsettling grace. I spent the first hour mingling, enjoying the champagne and canapes, and trying to decipher the identities hidden behind the masks. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep over me. I noticed certain guests who seemed to be watching me a little too closely, their masked gazes lingering a moment too long. During a lull in the music, a hush fell over the crowd as Mr. van der Luden, the enigmatic host, took to the stage. He welcomed the guests and announced the commencement of a special game, a treasure hunt, with a unique twist. Hidden somewhere within this estate, he announced, his voice amplified through the room, is a golden key. The first guest to find this key will be granted a wish, any wish their heart desires. A wave of excitement rippled through the crowd. Guests began to disperse, eager to explore the vast mansion and uncover the hidden treasure. I too was caught up in the thrill of the hunt. I searched through the opulent rooms, the library with its towering shelves, the conservatory filled with exotic plants, the art gallery showcasing priceless masterpieces. But the key remained elusive. As I ventured deeper into the mansion, I noticed that some of the guests were behaving strangely. They moved with a predatory grace, their masked faces expressionless, their eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. I stumbled upon a hidden room, its door slightly ajar. Intrigued, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with antique furniture and strange, unsettling artifacts. But it was the figure standing in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden behind a grotesque mask that resembled a snarling demon. He held a gleaming dagger in his hand. Before I could react, he lunged at me, the dagger flashing in the dim light. I screamed and dodged, narrowly avoiding the blade. I turned and fled, the man's heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I raced through the mansion, my heart pounding in my chest. The other guests seemed to have vanished, replaced by these masked figures who were now hunting me relentlessly. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I stumbled through hidden passages, climbed winding staircases, and dodged through secret doors. But the masked figures were always close behind, their footsteps echoing through the mansion like the hounds of hell. Finally, I burst out of a side door and into the gardens. The cool night air hit my face, and I gasped for breath. But I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I ran through the maze of hedges and flower beds, the masked figures still in pursuit. I could hear their heavy breathing, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths. Just when I thought I was cornered, I spotted a small gate hidden in the shadows. I slipped through it and found myself in a dark alleyway. I didn't hesitate. I kept running, my feet pounding on the pavement, until I reached the main road. I flagged down a passing taxi and collapsed onto the back seat, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. As the taxi sped away, I glanced back at the van der Luden's estate, its silhouette looming against the night sky, and I knew that I had escaped a nightmare, a masquerade ball that had turned into a deadly game of survival. The next day, the news was filled with the story of the Masquerade Ball massacre. Several guests had been found dead within the mansion, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The police investigation revealed that Mr. van der Luden and his associates were members of a secret society that practiced ancient and forbidden rituals. The treasure hunt had been a ruse, a way to select victims for their twisted ceremonies. I never attended another masked ball. The memory of that night, of the masked figures and the terror I felt, haunted me for years. But I also learned a valuable lesson, that beneath the surface of beauty and elegance, darkness can lurk, waiting to consume the unwary. Toxic relationship. This isn't a story seeking sympathy, but more of a way for me to finally accept what happened and move on. Hopefully, it can also help others recognize red flags in a relationship that I blindly overlooked. I'm 18 years old. I met this guy, let's call him Thomas, through a mutual group of friends that I was very close with for many years. We started hanging out as a group, and I was immediately infatuated. He had kind eyes and an adorable smile. Thomas had a bit of a reputation, past troubles with girlfriends and a known temper, but I ignored the warning signs, assuming he would never hurt me. We started dating in late March. He asked me out on a night when we had taken Xanax with friends, and he was very expressive about his feelings for me. Within 2 months, he claimed to be head over heels in love with me. I fell hard and fast. It's important to note that I had been diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder and bipolar II disorder, which added another layer of complexity to my life. Everything was good for the first 4 months or so. One night, I was planning to go out for drinks with Thomas and some friends, but I canceled because I was feeling unwell. He disappeared that night, his phone off for hours. Worried sick, I woke up to a message saying his phone had been broken when he got pushed into a pool and he had to leave it in Rice overnight. He came over to my house that day and took care of me. 2 months later, I found out that he had cheated on me that night. He had enticed his ex-girlfriend to come over, claiming he was suicidal because we had a fight. They slept together. When I found out, my heart broke. I confronted him, and he chased me down the street. I eventually managed to get away and told him to leave me alone. He then called back, saying he needed to go to the hospital because he had punched a mirror and shattered his hand. After a few weeks of heartbreak and him begging for me back, I foolishly gave in. I thought he must have really loved me to do all that. This was the biggest mistake I ever made. His behavior continued throughout our 6-month relationship. If I didn't answer a call, I received countless calls and messages, even if I just left my phone in another room for a few minutes. He demanded to see me all the time and begged to be by my side constantly. I saw all of this as an expression of his love. Our relationship revolved around smoking weed, all day, every day. If he wasn't stoned, all hell would break loose. I spent hundreds of dollars on weed to keep him calm. When we argued, he would threaten me and my friends. He would say things like he was going to kill our dogs. He isolated me from my friends, convincing me they weren't true friends and that he was the only one who truly cared. I believed him. My confidence and happiness diminished. I began to lose myself. I only felt happy when he was in a good mood and wanted to be affectionate. On our 6-month anniversary, we had a fancy dinner in the city. After the meal, he told me to wait around the corner while he paid and I called a cab. I later found out that he hadn't paid, and we had to run. Later that night, we went to visit our 2 best friends. We decided to go for a drive and smoke. While we were in the car, Thomas overheard me whispering with my friend Bella. He demanded to know what we were saying, and as a joke, Bella said I was talking about another boy. He flew into a rage and punched a hole through the car window. The police came, and I was left to walk Thomas home while he sobbed and apologized. We broke up that weekend after more incidents of him damaging property and physically intimidating me. I was scared and finally saw that he could be dangerous. The next morning, he made me pick him up, and he took the car to get the window fixed so I wouldn't leave him. I didn't forgive him, but a week later, after hundreds of calls and messages, he started sending me photos of bottles of Xanax, saying he was going to overdose and it would be my fault. I panicked and answered his call, begging him not to do anything stupid. I told him I would see him that afternoon to make sure he was okay, but not to get back together. That day, I was with some friends at a pool party. Thomas showed up, demanding that I leave with him. I refused. His eyes were filled with rage. He eventually left, but not before smashing the windows of another friend's car. We were all worried and decided to take the damaged car to my house. As I was driving, Thomas rammed my car at an intersection. He chased me through traffic, ramming my car repeatedly. I called the police, but they couldn't find me. He eventually cornered me in a parking lot, and I barely managed to escape. He chased me for what felt like an eternity, ramming my car, laughing, and taunting me. I drove to my dad's house, but then changed my mind, fearing for their safety. I drove through several suburbs trying to evade him. Finally, after 17 minutes, the police arrived. He was arrested and spent a weekend in jail. I was heartbroken and my mental health deteriorated. But for some reason, I still loved him. He was released on bail and started apologizing, claiming he had no memory of what he had done. And like a fool, I wanted to take him back. We continued talking, and the threats started again. He said things like, "I should have killed you," and "I'm going to kill everyone close to you." It took me 2 months to finally wake up and realize what I was doing. After he assaulted a boy I had kissed and started doing drive-bys at places I frequented, I finally broke things off for good. The saddest part is that when I asked him what he would have done if he had gotten into my car that day, he replied, "I honestly don't know. So, to anyone in a toxic relationship, please speak up. If you notice red flags, don't ignore them." If I had stayed with him, I wouldn't be here today to tell this story. Terror in the tunnel. The roar of the subway train echoed through the tunnel. The screeching of the brakes a jarring counterpoint to the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. As the train lurched to a halt between stations, plunging the car into darkness, a wave of panic washed over me. I was trapped underground, alone in a metal tube with something else. My name is Maya, and I'm a night owl. I love the energy of the city after dark, the way the familiar streets transform into a different world when the crowds thin and the shadows lengthen. I often take the subway late at night, enjoying the solitude and the chance to catch up on reading. But on this particular night, my peaceful commute turned into a terrifying ordeal. I was heading home from a friend's birthday party, the only passenger in the last car of the train. As we entered a long stretch of tunnel between stations, the lights flickered and died, plunging the car into darkness. First, I thought it was just a temporary power outage, a minor inconvenience. But then the train lurched violently, the brakes screeching as it ground to a halt. An announcement crackled over the intercom, the voice distorted and garbled. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was wrong. Fear coiled in my stomach. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. No signal. Of course not. We were deep underground. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably just a technical malfunction, that they'd have us moving again soon. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence in the car grew heavier, more oppressive. And then I heard it, a soft, slithering sound, like something dragging across the floor. I strained my eyes in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it, a shape, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the car. It was tall and slender, with long, spindly limbs that moved with an unnatural fluidity. Its eyes glowed with an eerie green light, and its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. I gasped, pressing myself back against the seat. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. But the creature kept advancing, its movements graceful yet predatory. I knew I had to do something. I scrambled to my feet, searching frantically for a weapon, anything to defend myself with. My eyes fell on the emergency hammer, mounted on the wall near the door. I grabbed it, my hand trembling. The creature lunged, its claws outstretched. I swung the hammer with all my might, connecting with its shoulder. It shrieked, a sound that echoed through the tunnel, and recoiled, its eyes blazing with fury. I knew I'd only bought myself a few precious seconds. I had to get out of there. I smashed the window next to the door, the safety glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The creature lunged again, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps echoing on the tracks, its shrieks growing closer. I didn't know how far I had to run, or if there was even an escape route, but I kept going, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around me. Suddenly, I saw a light ahead, a maintenance access door, slightly ajar. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself against the door, bursting into a small, dimly lit room. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling for the lock. I could hear the creature pounding on the other side, its claws scraping against the metal. But the door held. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I had escaped, but the memory of that creature, of the terror I felt in the darkness of the tunnel, would stay with me forever. I never took the subway late at night again. And whenever I find myself in a confined space, a shiver runs down my spine, and I can't help but wonder if there's something lurking in the shadows, waiting to drag me back into the darkness. The D&D Night Invader. This happened about 10 years ago when I was in college. At the urging of some friends, I decided to host an open invite D&D session at my apartment. It was close to campus but not part of the dorms. It was above a restaurant. This detail is important for later. The night of the session arrived, and everyone seemed nice enough, except for one guy. There's always that one guy, right? I tried to let it slide, but he was being pushy and wouldn't stop going on and on about his character's backstory. We hadn't even gotten to his character yet, and he was already trying to control the game. He had some kind of grudge against another player and kept trying to get me to help him kill that guy's character for no reason. It made no sense in the context of the game, and it would have accomplished nothing. For those who don't play D&D, it's not like you have to permanently retire a character if they die in a one-off game. This guy was all up in my personal space, whispering in my ear, passing me notes, and telling me how to play. It was really uncomfortable and weird. I didn't want to make a scene, so I decided to just ignore him and try to have a good time. When it became clear that I wasn't going to listen to him, he had a meltdown. He stood up and started throwing D&D books at my head, screaming that I should have done what he told me to do and that this was my punishment. I opened the door and told him to get out. He told me I couldn't kick him out because someone else had invited him. I told him I didn't care who invited him. This was my apartment, and I had every right to kick him out. He was lucky I wasn't calling the cops. The rest of the table backed me up and pretty much ended up having to shove him out the door to get him to leave. The guy couldn't grasp the fact that no means no and that his actions had consequences. I'm pretty sure no one had ever made him face any consequences before, judging by the baffled look on his face as I closed the door behind him. I went back upstairs and people started apologizing to me, saying he was like that all the time. They didn't actually invite him. He just showed up wherever they went, and they couldn't get him to leave them alone. We got back to the game, and things were going well for about 20 minutes until I heard my doorbell ring. I went downstairs, and it was the tantrum guy with some other guy I had never met before. The tantrum guy was standing behind this new guy with his chest puffed out, like, "You're in trouble now." I opened the door and asked if they were here to apologize for the tantrum guy's assault. The new guy immediately turned around to look at the tantrum guy, and it was clear he hadn't gotten the whole story. I told him what actually happened, and he told me that he was an RA with the school and that I had to let the guy back into my apartment if I was holding a school function. I told the RA guy that, first of all, I rented this apartment, and it wasn't part of student housing, which should have been apparent from the fact that it was above a restaurant. Secondly, even if he was an RA, which I had no proof of, that didn't give him authority over any building I lived in because he wasn't my RA. And finally, that this wasn't a school event, it was a private gathering, which he would know if he was a real RA and not just some guy the tantrum guy had brought along for who knows what reason. This RA guy kept insisting that I had to let him in and that if I was a student, then wherever I lived was student housing and that he needed to come in to inspect the place. It became more and more clear that this was just some random guy who wanted to get into my apartment, thinking I was alone for some reason. I told them they weren't getting in, and if they continued to try to get me to let them in or tried my door after I left, I was going to call the cops. I shut the door and went back upstairs. Everyone at the party was asking who that was, and when I told them, they all decided it was time to head home. I told them they didn't have to, but they said it was getting late, and this whole thing was getting weird. Couldn't blame them. When I went downstairs to see them out, the tantrum guy and the RA guy were across the street, seemingly amazed that these people were still at my apartment and were now leaving. I never had any more trouble with them, but I also never hosted another D&D night. It just didn't seem worth it. I still play D&D, but only with groups that I know. The Stalker in the Woods. The forest floor was a tapestry of fallen leaves, their vibrant colors muted by the encroaching twilight. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the familiar sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, were replaced by an unsettling silence. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, their presence a silent threat in the gathering darkness. My name is David, and I'm an avid birdwatcher. I love the thrill of spotting a rare species, the challenge of capturing its beauty through my camera lens. This particular weekend, I'd ventured into a secluded section of the Redwood National Park, hoping to photograph the elusive marbled murrelet. I'd been hiking for hours, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, my senses attuned to the subtle signs of wildlife. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the towering trees, a prickle of unease ran down my spine. I had the distinct feeling of being observed. I paused, scanning the surrounding woods, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees, their branches intertwined overhead, and the occasional flitting shadow of a bird. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, a side effect of spending too much time alone in the wilderness. But as I continued my hike, the feeling persisted. I would catch glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision, hear the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves just beyond my line of sight. Each time I turned to investigate, however, there was nothing there. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. I knew I should head back to my car, but I was determined to get a shot of the murrelet. I pressed on, my camera at the ready. As darkness enveloped the forest, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, matching my pace. I would stop and the footsteps would stop, my camera bag bouncing against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the footsteps behind me kept pace, relentless and unwavering. I didn't know how long I ran or how far. The forest was a maze of towering trees and tangled undergrowth, the darkness obscuring any landmarks. I stumbled and fell, my camera bag tumbling from my shoulder. As I scrambled to retrieve it, I heard a voice close behind me. "Don't move." The voice was low and menacing, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned to face my pursuer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in the shadows of a hooded sweatshirt. He held a knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "Someone who's been watching you," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Someone who knows you're alone out here." He took a step closer, and I could see his eyes, cold and calculating. I knew I was in trouble. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to buy myself some time. Just to have a little fun, he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. He lunged at me, the knife flashing. I screamed and dodged, the blade narrowly missing my arm. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the man's laughter echoing behind me. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear him behind me, gaining ground. Suddenly, I stumbled into a clearing, and there, in the center of the clearing, was a small cabin, a light flickering in the window. Hope surged through me. Maybe there was someone inside, someone who could help. I raced towards the cabin, pounding on the door. "Help!" I shouted. "Please, let me in." The door swung open, revealing an elderly woman with kind eyes and a worried expression. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked. I didn't have time to explain. I pushed past her, into the safety of the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the man's footsteps approaching, his frustrated curses echoing through the night. The woman quickly bolted the door, her hands trembling. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "I don't know," I said, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "But he's trying to hurt me." We huddled together in the small cabin, listening to the man's rage outside. He pounded on the door, shouting threats, but the sturdy old cabin held firm. Eventually, his frustration seemed to wane. We heard his footsteps retreat, fading into the distance. We waited a long time, just to be sure he was gone, before cautiously opening the door. The forest was silent now, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. I thanked the woman profusely for her kindness and set off back to my car, my heart still pounding. I never went back to that section of the woods. The memory of that night, of the stalker in the shadows, haunted me for a long time. But I also learned a valuable lesson that night, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the power of human kindness. The glowing eyes. Let's start with some background. At the time, I was a seasoned reconnaissance trooper on my first long-term combat tour. Not even a month prior, I had witnessed the horrific death of one of my best friends and the maiming of 2 others in a brutal ambush. It was a nightmare, and the trauma was still fresh. After that ambush, we were relocated from the city to a forward operating base, FOB. Think of it as a small, fortified city with concrete barriers and HESCO barriers, those big, earth-filled boxes stacked high to create a protective wall. This particular FOB was unique because some of its barriers were simply huge mounds of dirt with guard towers on top. As a reconnaissance unit, our task was to constantly patrol outside the wire, acting as a rapid response force for any situation requiring quick and skilled firepower or extraction. We had helicopters and armored Humvees at our disposal, and we lived near the makeshift airfield on the FOB's outskirts. Our living quarters consisted of tents with insulated foam covering and air conditioning units. There were 20 of us, divided into 2 squads, sharing this little tent village. In the middle of our village was the latrine trailer, a modified house trailer with showers, sinks, and toilets. One night, around 4 a.m., I woke up needing to use the restroom. I grabbed my headlamp, rifle, and a magazine and headed out. As I walked towards the latrine trailer, something felt off. Maybe it was a subtle change in air pressure, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I quickly finished my business in the trailer and stepped back outside. As I rounded the corner, I looked up and froze. A pair of glowing green eyes, set in the darkest fur I had ever seen, were inches from my face. I'm not a tall guy, and maybe it was the adrenaline, but I swear this thing was at my eye level. I thought I must be seeing things, so I turned my head, and when I looked back, there was nothing there but a wisp of dust. I stood there for a moment, trying to regain my composure, and then I looked down. There, on the ground, were huge paw prints. I was shaking and sweating like I had just been in a firefight. I quickly went back to my tent, loaded my rifle, and peeked around the corner to make sure the creature was gone. I then went to the radio tent to report what I had seen to the 2 guys who were still awake. After that, I cautiously returned to my tent and tried to get some sleep. The next day, One of the first things mentioned in the daily briefing was about a huge panther that had escaped from a local sheik's compound and was preying on local shepherds' sheep at night. We were warned to be on the lookout and never leave our tents alone. We never saw that panther again, and I don't know what happened to it. But I do know that every time I walked outside my tent at night after that, I was always armed and ready. The cabin in the woods. The old cabin nestled deep in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains had always held a special allure for me. It was a relic of a bygone era, a place where time seemed to stand still. My grandparents had spent their summers there, and I had fond childhood memories of exploring the surrounding woods and swimming in the crystal-clear lake nearby. So when they offered to let me use the cabin for a weekend getaway, I jumped at the chance. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The cabin was just as I remembered it, rustic and charming, with a wide front porch and a stone fireplace that promised cozy evenings. I unpacked my bags, built a fire, and settled in for a weekend of relaxation and solitude. As darkness fell, I curled up on the couch with a book, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the wooden siding. But I felt safe and secure within the sturdy walls of the cabin. It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest, that I first noticed it, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere within the walls. At first, I dismissed it as mice or perhaps squirrels nesting in the attic. But as the night wore on, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be moving, traveling from one wall to another, as if something were trying to claw its way out. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was undeniable. I got up and grabbed a flashlight, shining the beam along the walls, searching for any sign of an intruder. But there was nothing. I went back to bed, but sleep eluded me. The scratching continued, relentless and unnerving. I tossed and turned. It seemed to emanate from the very heart of the cabin, as if whatever was inside the walls was now directly beneath me. Terror gripped me. I leaped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course not. I was miles from civilization, completely alone with whatever was lurking within the walls of the cabin. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, flashlight in hand, listening to the scratching and growling that seemed to grow louder with every passing hour. As soon as the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, I was out the door, fleeing the cabin as if the devil himself were on my heels. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing truck driver. He gave me a strange look, but agreed to take me to the nearest town. I never went back to the cabin. When I'm alone in the quiet of my own home, I think I can hear it again, that faint scratching, that low growl, reminding me that there are some places in this world where we are not meant to tread, where ancient secrets and unseen terrors lie hidden, waiting to be unleashed. The intruder. This happened about a year ago. I often dog sit for my coworkers at the hospital for extra cash. One of the nurses, let's call her Sarah, asked me to dog sit for her while she and her family went out of town. I had done this many times before, so I had no problem dog sitting alone. Sarah lived in a very nice and safe area, so I wasn't expecting any trouble. She told me that her husband was a police officer and that they had a security system that recorded everything by the doors. She gave me the code to the security system, but I assured her that I would be fine. The first couple of nights were fairly normal. It was a big house, so it was a little creepy, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. One night, my boyfriend at the time and I were watching TV. The blinds were open to the backyard, and it was probably around midnight. We saw a light flash through the yard, but it wasn't a car passing by because it angled down towards the grass. The dog was in his kennel, so we knew it wasn't him. We decided to go outside and check it out, but there was no one there. We went back to bed, but while we were lying in the bedroom upstairs talking, we heard a door shut downstairs. I immediately shushed my boyfriend and said, "Did you hear that?" He said, "Yeah, but I don't know what it was." He got up to lock the bedroom door and turn off the lights. He whispered to me, "Be quiet and listen." We sat in the dark room, shaking. We heard another door shut downstairs. He told me to call the police as he grabbed a lamp and stood by the door. I called 911 and tried to explain what was happening, but the operator kept trying to calm me down, saying that officers were on their way. Then we heard footsteps coming upstairs. I started to cry, telling the operator that the person was upstairs with us now. We heard a knock at the door and footsteps going back down the stairs. I told the operator, "You're insane. There's someone in this house, and you want me to go downstairs." She told me that it was protocol to let the police in. My boyfriend and I ran downstairs as fast as we could and opened the door for the police. We told them that there was someone in the house and what we had heard. They walked in, telling us to wait outside while they investigated. One officer went straight outside to the back and yelled out, "If anyone is out there, make yourself known." My boyfriend and I heard rustling in the bushes near us. The officers didn't find anyone in the home, but we knew that there was someone there. We knew what we had heard. A couple of months later, we were watching a movie about a home invasion, and we got to talking about our experience. My boyfriend suddenly remembered something. He said that on the day of the invasion, he had met someone who had asked him if the car in the driveway was for sale. He had told the guy that he didn't know because he was just dog-sitting. I realized then that I had probably met the intruder too. I remembered that I had been outside around morning time, getting ready to go to my car, when a young man walked by and asked me if the car in the driveway was for sale. I had told him that I didn't know because I was just dog-sitting. I had no idea at the time what I had done, but I know now that the man who asked me about the car was the same man who broke into the house that night. I'm still afraid to dog-sit again after that experience. The man with the melting face. I've been an avid cyclist all my life. It's my preferred mode of transportation, and I live in a town known for its extensive network of bike paths. I'm also an Iraq War veteran, which might explain something that happens later in this story. One gorgeous August day, I decided to go for a ride after work. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I felt like exploring a southbound trail I didn't frequent. It was a relatively safe route, bordering a popular city park, so I figured there would be plenty of people around, especially on such a nice day. About 20 minutes into my ride, I approached a couple of bends in the path near the park. There were a few joggers, dog walkers, and people strolling by themselves, nothing unusual. The trail was paved and divided into 2 lanes, just like a regular road. Up ahead, I noticed a man with dark hair walking in the wrong lane. It wasn't illegal, but it could be dangerous, and he seemed to have no regard for others. I initially thought he might be drunk. Then I noticed he was wearing a thick, navy blue puffy jacket on a humid summer day. It was an odd choice, to say the least. I was about 30 feet away when he finally saw me, and my stomach dropped. He paused mid-step, and his face contorted into a grotesque, downward-facing Joker-like smile. He opened his jacket, revealing a sweat-soaked gray shirt underneath, and reached inside for something I couldn't see. In that moment, something in my head snapped. Instead of turning around, screaming, or stopping, I pedaled faster. I pushed the pedals as hard as I could, intending to charge him like a medieval juicer. I don't know why my brain decided that charging him head-on was the right thing to do. Could have easily gotten me hurt or killed, but I didn't care. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was some primal instinct kicking in, but I felt this surge of energy and determination. He saw me speeding up but didn't move out of the way. It wasn't until I was less than 2 feet away that he seemed to realize what was about to happen, and he dove to the left. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just kept going. Later, I passed a couple of joggers coming the other way and warned them about the man. They promptly turned around. I took a different route home that day and made sure all my doors were locked when I got there. I haven't been on that stretch of trail since. I didn't report the incident to the police at the time, thinking they wouldn't be able to do much since I wasn't harmed. But about a month later, a local news story popped up on my Facebook feed. The decomposed body of a man had been discovered near the creek in the same area of the trail where I had encountered the strange man. The police weren't sure how he died, but it didn't look natural. The victim was a homeless man, someone nobody would miss. I'm not saying that I definitely prevented a murder that day, but the thought has crossed my mind. 5 seconds of my life were potentially significant in a way I couldn't have imagined at the time. The cursed artifact. The antique shop was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, its shelves overflowing with dusty relics and forgotten trinkets. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the faded tapestries and tarnished silver. A collector of the unusual and the macabre was drawn to a display case tucked away in a dimly lit corner. Inside, nestled amongst velvet lining, lay an ornate mask, its intricate carvings hinting at a dark and ancient power. I couldn't resist its allure. I purchased the mask, eager to add it to my collection of curiosities. As I left the shop, the shopkeeper's parting words echoed in my mind. "Be careful with that one, young man. It has a history." I scoffed at his warning, dismissing it as superstitious nonsense. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had acquired something more than just a decorative artifact. The mask seemed to pulse with a strange energy, its presence growing stronger with every passing mile. That night, I hung the mask on the wall of my study, its intricate details catching the light of the moon. As I admired it, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to try it on. I hesitated, a flicker of unease in my gut. But curiosity, as always, got the better of me. I carefully lifted the mask and placed it over my face. The moment it touched my skin, a jolt of energy surged through me, a feeling of power and darkness unlike anything I had ever experienced. I felt a thrill of exhilaration, a sense of being connected to something ancient and powerful. But then, the mask began to tighten, its edges digging into my flesh. I tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flared in my chest as I realized I was trapped, bound to this cursed artifact. I ran to the mirror, my heart pounding in my ears. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't my own. The mask had transformed my features, twisting them into a grotesque mockery of my former self. My eyes glowed with an eerie red light, and my mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house. I clawed at the mask, desperate to remove it, but it was no use. It was fused to my skin, a part of me now. Days turned into nights, and still the mask remained. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the horrifying reflection that now stared back at me from every mirror. The mask's power grew stronger, twisting my thoughts, my desires, my very essence. I became a recluse, hiding from the world, ashamed of the monstrous creature I had become. The mask's influence spread, corrupting my mind, whispering dark secrets and forbidden desires. I tried everything to remove the mask, doctors, priests, even exorcists, but nothing worked. The mask was a part of me now, a curse I would carry for the rest of my days. In the end, I succumbed to the mask's power, embracing the darkness it offered. I became a creature of the night, preying on the innocent, my twisted desires fueled by the ancient evil that now resided within me. And so, the collector became the collected, a victim of his own insatiable curiosity and the cursed artifact that had consumed his soul. 5 seconds. 5 seconds. That's all it took. 5 seconds for my entire life to shatter. We were at a crowded fairground, trying to navigate through the throngs of people. I was holding my 3-year-old son Dylan's hand tightly, but in the chaos, his hand slipped away from mine. 2 precious seconds passed before I realized he wasn't reaching into his pocket for his favorite toy car. I frantically searched for him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dylan!" I called out, my voice barely audible above the noise of the crowd. And just like that, he was gone. It didn't matter how loud I screamed. It didn't matter that they caught the man on camera. One hand clamped over my son's mouth, Dylan looking like a rag doll in his arms. It didn't matter that I pleaded with the public for help, that the FBI conducted a nationwide manhunt. Dylan's face joined the long line of missing children, swallowed up by the earth. He had only wanted to see the clouds for his birthday. On the first anniversary of his disappearance, my son would have turned 6. Instead, a man walking his dog found Dylan's body in a hollowed-out tree. The inspector said he had been dead for a long time, frozen. The man had frozen his body. No one knows exactly when Dylan was killed, but they knew he didn't die the day he was taken. On the second anniversary of his death, Dylan would have been 7. Instead, at exactly 1 minute past midnight, I received a message on my phone from an unknown number with a photo attachment. 2 words, "For you." I knew what I would see when I opened it. Dylan's decayed body in the hollow tree. But this photo had been taken at night, the edges almost completely black. The flash illuminating my son's remains with horrifying clarity. The police and the FBI failed to trace the source of the message. On the 3rd anniversary of his death, Dylan would have been 8. I had a new phone, a new number, a new house in a new state, a new life, but it didn't matter. He found me. He left an envelope taped to my door. "For you." I opened the photo. Dylan dead, but not in the hollow tree. Now he was lying on a couch, his body more recently deceased. In the corner of the photo was a hand, clad in a black leather glove, a closed fist with the thumb pointed up. The police were useless. The FBI said they could set up a trace program for the following year, in case another picture was sent on Dylan's birthday. That was all they could do. On the 4th anniversary of his death, 2 FBI agents sat with me as I stared at my phone, at the new message that read, "For you." Dylan was in the back seat of a car, clearly dead, but his body fresher. I hated that word, but it was the only one that came to mind. His head lolled to the side, and I could see the man's face in the driver's seat, staring at the camera. A few moments passed before something else became clear. The picture had been taken in a way that I could see through the car window. Houses, cars, mailboxes. For one brief second, I thought this was it, the slip-up we had been waiting for. Finally, a chance to find him. The FBI agents studied the picture, and then I saw the color drain from their faces. What is it?" I screamed at them. They simply placed the picture on the table and pointed to one of the houses. My own house. Dylan's house. More details emerged. Several black sedans parked on the street, FBI cars. A gaggle of reporters on my front lawn. This picture had been taken only a month after Dylan disappeared. On quieter days, when the nightmare recedes, I take a small, sick comfort in knowing that Dylan's ordeal ended sooner than I had imagined. Then one of the agents pointed to the top left corner of the photo. Past Dylan's body, through the back window of the car, you could make out a figure. The man, a featureless shadow except for one detail. Teeth bared in a wide grin. On the 5th anniversary of Dylan's death, I'm sitting at my kitchen table. I don't have a phone anymore. I moved to the country off the grid, but it didn't matter. He found me. He left an envelope taped to my door. "For you." I haven't slept in 4 days. Astral projection warning. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone interested in astral projection. Stay away. Trust me, no good will come from it. There are things out there, non-human things, that will take any chance they can to latch onto you. I know this because they're after me. A week ago, I found an online forum about astral projection. People described their out-of-body experiences, flying through space and consciously manipulating their dreams. I was fascinated. I've always loved the feeling of being transported to another world in my mind, so I decided to try it. I researched different methods and made sure there were no negative health effects. To my relief, there were very few warnings, and the ones that were listed seemed like nonsense. So, the next morning, I attempted astral projection. I wish I could go back and tell myself to stop. I wish I could tell myself what would happen. Feels like a lifetime ago now. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. and woke up feeling drowsy, which the website said was necessary. I laid back down and tried to project. I followed the instructions, and at first I didn't feel anything. But then, a strange sensation developed in my chest. It spread throughout my body, and suddenly, I felt myself lift off the ground. My eyes were still closed, but I knew I was floating. I opened my eyes, and I was above my body. It was a bizarre and surreal experience. But what freaked me out was that the lights in my room were off. I distinctly remembered turning them on. The sky outside my windows was pitch black, not like nighttime, but like a void. I quickly looked around my room to make sure everything else was normal, but the darkness outside was unsettling. I decided to walk around my house, and to my surprise, every light was off. It was completely dark. As I was exploring, I heard a door slam loudly upstairs. I live alone in a small house. There was no way this was a visitor. I was startled and went upstairs to investigate. I checked all the rooms but found nothing. Then I realized the sound had come from my own bedroom. The door was slammed shut. I cautiously opened the door and looked inside. It was darker than before, but the room seemed empty except for my motionless body on the bed. I checked under the bed and in the closet, but there was nothing there. I laughed nervously, feeling paranoid. Then I felt something drip on my shoulder. Something black. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. It was a horrifying creature, like something out of a nightmare. Tall and skeletal, with long, spindly limbs and gray skin stretched tightly over its bones. Black sludge was oozing from its mouth, and its eyes were empty sockets. It grinned at me, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I screamed and backed away. The creature dropped to the floor and crawled towards my body. It started to vomit its black fluid all over my leg. I realized I had to wake up. I lunged for my body and tried to pull myself back in. I saw the creature lunge at me, but it missed. I woke up screaming. I tried to get out of bed, but I couldn't move my right leg. There was also a searing pain in my shoulder. I called my mom, and she took me to the hospital. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with me and said it was probably psychological. I didn't tell them about the creature or the astral projection. I went home and tried to sleep, but I had a nightmare. I was back in that dark version of my room, and the creature was there again. It crawled onto the bed and whispered in my ear, "You're still here." Then it vomited more black fluid on my left leg. I woke up, unable to feel my left leg. That was 4 nights ago. I haven't slept since. I've searched the internet for anything that can help me, but I've found nothing. I'm writing this as a warning. Do not attempt astral projection. Do not venture into that world. It's full of hostility and horror. They're after us. It's after me. I don't have much time left. I know that the next time I fall asleep, it will get me. I can see it standing in front of me now, smiling. Please don't make the same mistake I did. The Night Watchman. The old clock tower cast a long shadow over the deserted streets, its chimes echoing through the stillness of the night. As the new night watchman at the Blackwood Historical Museum, I was tasked with guarding its priceless artifacts and ensuring the safety of its silent inhabitants. Little did I know that my first night on the job would be far from uneventful. A chilling encounter with the supernatural that would test the limits of my courage. My name is James, and I'm a history enthusiast. When the opportunity arose to work as a night watchman at the Blackwood Museum, I was thrilled. The museum housed a fascinating collection of artifacts from around the world, each with its own unique story to tell. I imagined spending my nights wandering the dimly lit halls, learning the secrets of the past. But on my first night, I discovered that the museum held more than just historical relics. It was also home to something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. As I made my rounds, checking the locks and ensuring that all was secure, I began to notice strange occurrences. Doors creaked open and closed on their own. But as the night wore on, the occurrences grew more frequent, more unsettling. I began to feel a sense of unease, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that warned me I was not alone. I entered the Egyptian exhibit, its dimly lit cases displaying ancient sarcophagi and mummified remains. As I passed a particular sarcophagus, I felt a sudden chill, a wave of icy air that seemed to emanate from within the case. I paused, my flashlight beam illuminating the hieroglyphs carved into the lid of the sarcophagus. As I studied the symbols, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to open the case. I hesitated, a sense of foreboding washing over me. But curiosity, as always, got the better of me. I carefully lifted the lid of the sarcophagus, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, wrapped in linen bandages, lay the mummified remains of an ancient pharaoh. But as I gazed upon the pharaoh's face, its linen wrappings unraveling as it rose from its eternal slumber, I turned and fled, the mummy's guttural cries echoing through the museum. I raced through the exhibits, dodging ancient statues and priceless artifacts as the mummy pursued me relentlessly. Its footsteps were heavy and deliberate, its presence filling the museum with an aura of dread. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I burst through doors, scrambled over display cases, and hid behind towering suits of armor. But the mummy was always close behind, its relentless pursuit driving me to the brink of madness. Finally, I found myself trapped in the medieval armory, surrounded by swords, axes, and other implements of war. The mummy cornered me, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. I knew I was no match for this ancient evil. But as the mummy lunged at me, I grabbed a nearby sword and swung it with all my might. The blade sliced through the mummy's bandages, and with a hiss of escaping air, the creature collapsed into a pile of dust. I stood there, panting, the sword still clutched in my hand. As the dust settled around me, I had vanquished the mummy, but the experience had shaken me to my core. I never forgot that night at the Blackwood Museum. The memory of the mummy, of its relentless pursuit and malevolent gaze, haunted my dreams for years to come. And I learned a valuable lesson that night, that some relics of the past are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within the sands of time. The alien abduction. This happened to me 7 weeks ago, and it was a truly terrifying experience. My name is Leslie, and I'm in my last year of high school. I often have trouble sleeping and usually get only 3 hours of sleep a night. When I stay up late, I like to watch my favorite TV show, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. One Friday morning, around 2:30 a.m., I was still watching It's Always Sunny. I started to get tired, so I decided to go to bed after the episode finished. As I was falling asleep, I noticed a strange sensation. My body felt like it was vibrating, and I kept hearing a loud buzzing noise. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't move or speak. I could only move my eyes. I looked to the left corner of the room, and what I saw terrified me. There was a shadow standing there, looking at me. It looked like the aliens from the movie VHS 2. They had long, black fingers and legs, and they were getting closer to me. I tried to scream, but I could only hum. My humming began to fade away, and I tried to force my body to move, but I still couldn't. Felt like my soul was trapped inside. Then, my toe started to move, and I woke up with a gasp. I was traumatized by what I had seen. I thought I had seen the devil in my room. I checked my phone, and it was 4:15 a.m. I decided not to go back to sleep and went to school that morning, exhausted and terrified. I spent days without sleeping, afraid that it would happen again. I drank energy drinks to stay awake. After a week and a half, I did some research and discovered that what I had experienced might have been sleep paralysis. Apparently, about 30% of people who experience sleep paralysis have similar encounters. I haven't had anything like that happen again, and I hope I never do. The back garden and the sofa. This is a 2-part story. A few weeks before the main incident, I saw something strange in the sky above Birmingham, England. I was sitting in my back garden, smoking and admiring the full moon, when I saw something fly into view. It was shaped like a deodorant can, with pulsing red, white, and blue lights along the bottom and bright white beams shining from the top. It had no wings or any visible means of propulsion. I had no idea what it was, and I never saw it on the news. Now, for the main story. One night, my sister was staying over with her kids. She took my bed, and I slept on the sofa. I fell asleep listening to paranormal stories on YouTube. I woke up to a horrifying experience. I was paralyzed and terrified. I was facing the back of the sofa, and I could feel something strange happening on the back of my neck. It wasn't painful, but it felt like a drilling sensation. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed but twitching all over. I could hear a buzzing, whooshing sound, like a flying saucer. Then, a sense of calm came over me, and I thought it was just a reaction to the drugs I had taken earlier. But then I realized I hadn't taken any drugs. The panic returned, and I lay there in horror for a few more minutes until I suddenly regained control of my body. I quickly turned around to see the back door move as if someone had just run out. There were red, white, and blue lights flashing in the room. My living room is at the back of the house, with a large garden behind it. We're far away from any roads, so the lights couldn't have come from a car. I thought maybe it was the lights on the internet box flashing, but then I realized there was no internet box. It was as if someone was trying to implant thoughts into my head to keep me from freaking out. I felt violated and frightened. My dog, a large husky wolf mix, was up on the armchair, shaking and refusing to come down. He was not easily frightened, so this was unusual. I didn't get back to sleep that night. I lay awake, still twitching and feeling a cold sensation shooting down my spine. I don't know what it was, but the next day when I told my friends about it, they noticed 3 small red puncture marks in the shape of a triangle on the back of my neck. The cursed doll. The flea market was a kaleidoscope of sights and sounds, a chaotic symphony of vendors hawking their wares and bargain hunters sifting through piles of forgotten treasures. I, a lover of the unique and the unusual, was drawn to a stall tucked away in a quiet corner. The stall's owner, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, sat surrounded by an eclectic collection of dolls, their painted faces staring out at the world with a mixture of innocence and eerie knowing. One doll in particular caught my attention. It was a porcelain doll, dressed in a faded Victorian gown, its delicate features frozen in a melancholic expression. Its eyes, however, were what truly captivated me. They were large and luminous, a deep shade of blue that seemed to hold a hint of sadness and a touch of something else, something unsettling. I couldn't resist its allure. I purchased the doll, eager to add it to my collection of oddities. As I left the flea market, the old woman's parting words echoed in my mind. "Be careful with that one, dear. It has a soul." I chuckled to myself, dismissing her warning as the ramblings of an eccentric old woman. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this doll. Its presence seemed to grow stronger with every passing mile, its gaze fixed on me from the passenger seat. That night, I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, its melancholic eyes staring out at the room. As I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I saw the doll's eyes flicker, a hint of movement in the dim light. I woke with a start in the middle of the night, a cold sweat clinging to my skin. The room was dark, but I could feel the doll's presence, its gaze heavy upon me. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, fumbling for the switch. As the light flickered on, I gasped. The doll was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it sat at the foot of my bed, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself I must have misplaced the doll, that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, very wrong. The next morning, I awoke to find the doll back on the shelf, its expression as melancholic as ever. I tried to dismiss the events of the previous night as a bad dream, but the feeling of unease lingered. As the days passed, strange occurrences began to plague my life. Objects moved on their own. Whispers echoed through the empty house, and I would often catch glimpses of the doll's eyes following me from the shadows. I tried to get rid of the doll, to throw it away, to burn it. But every time I tried, a wave of nausea would wash over me, and a voice, soft and pleading, would whisper in my ear, "Don't leave me." I was trapped, bound to this cursed doll. Its presence grew stronger, its influence seeping into my thoughts and dreams. I became withdrawn, isolated, my life consumed by the fear that gripped me. One night, I awoke to find the doll standing over me, its eyes glowing with an eerie blue light. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't comprehend, but the tone was unmistakable. It was threatening me. I screamed, the sound echoing through the empty house. I thrashed against the doll, trying to push it away, but its grip was surprisingly strong. Its eyes bored into mine, filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. I knew then that I was no match for this evil. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But the end never came. When I opened my eyes, the doll was gone. The room was silent, the only sound the beating of my own heart. I never saw the doll again, but the memory of its haunting eyes, of its sinister presence, continues to haunt me to this day. And I know that somewhere out there, in the darkness, that cursed doll is waiting, searching for its next victim. The Figures in the Field. This is a two-part story that takes place in southwestern Sweden, about 10 kilometers from Gothenburg. The first part happened to my friend. It was a summer evening, and my friends were hanging out near a roundabout in their village, enjoying the long daylight hours of the Swedish summer. The village was small, with only 500 or 600 residents, so there wasn't much traffic. My friend was talking with his friends when one of them noticed some strange figures moving in the distance. They all looked and saw 4 or 5 completely white, humanoid figures darting back and forth across the fields. The figures would run into view between a couple of garages, then disappear and reappear on the other side. It almost seemed like they wanted to be seen. My friends thought it might be someone playing a prank, but the figures' strange, paper-white appearance and their bizarre way of running made them question that idea. The figures ran on their toes, hunched forward, with their arms flailing, and they didn't make a sound. One of my friends started shouting at the figures, asking what they were, but they didn't respond. My friend who told me this story, let's call him Johan, looked genuinely unnerved when he recounted the experience. I had never seen him so serious before. Whatever he saw that night clearly disturbed him. The hissing creature. The second part of the story takes place in September 2017. I was visiting my friend Mark, who was attending college about 4 or 5 hours away from where I lived on the West Coast. Mark's girlfriend, Karen, and another friend, Shin, drove out with me on a Friday afternoon. We arrived late that night and met up with Mark, who gave us a tour of his dorm. After playing pool in the rec room for a while, Mark and Karen said they needed some alone time, as Mark's roommate was out of town. Shin and I didn't want to pay for a hotel, but Karen convinced Mark to cover the cost, so we headed to our hotel. Once we arrived, Shin started a Skype call with his girlfriend, who couldn't make the trip. I asked Shin if he wanted to go out to the farmland outside of town to take some long exposure photos of the stars, but he declined. I was disappointed because I didn't know how to use a camera for long exposure shots yet, and I really needed Shin's help. That's when I remembered something else I wanted to do. I'm a graffiti artist, and I love to paint freight trains. I find it easier to paint trains in the middle of nowhere than in the industrial district of a city, where there's always the risk of getting caught. I told Shin about my plan, and he agreed to let me borrow Karen's car. I stocked up on supplies at Walmart and drove through a couple of towns, scanning the railroad tracks for a suitable train car to paint. I didn't find anything in the first 2 towns, but in the third town, I found several parked between wheat fields. I parked at a gas station and headed out into the darkness, looking for a car that hadn't already been painted. I eventually found an old Canadian grain car and started to gather my supplies. About 15 minutes into painting, I heard a low, gurgling sound about 10 to 20 yards away. I looked around, worried that a farmer or a gas station attendant had found me, but I only saw a single tree in the distance. The gurgling sound continued, and I became curious. It was 2 or 3 in the morning, and I couldn't imagine anyone else being around. I turned on my flashlight, using my hand to cover the beam so as not to attract attention. I pointed the light towards the tree, and the gurgling sound stopped. There was a dried-up embankment near the tree, and I could smell cow manure, which reminded me of the farm I used to live on in the Midwest. I noticed a fuzzy, tan-colored lump in the embankment. I didn't want to get closer, so I climbed up the ladder on the train car. As I climbed, I felt a sense of dread, like I was being watched. I looked back at the gas station, but there was no one there. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned on my flashlight and saw that the lump in the embankment was a dead deer. From my higher vantage point, I could see that it wasn't as tan as I had initially thought. There was a grayish-purple tinge to it, which I assumed was the beginning of decomposition. There was a lot of blood from a wound in the deer's belly. As I stared at the deer, I heard a sudden snap, which startled me. I quickly climbed to the top of the train car and watched the tree in the distance. I froze in place as I tried to scan the area for any movement. That's when I saw it, and I got a better look at it. It was smaller than I had initially thought, skinny and gray-looking, with a humanoid shape. I immediately got the hell out of there. I ran back to my car, hearing one last faint hiss as I reached the gas station parking lot. I jumped in the car and sped off, blasting music and using my high beams all the way back to town. I was more hysterical than scared, but I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. I made it back to the hotel safely, but I left my supplies behind. I regretted that, but I also didn't want anyone else to experience what I did that night. I've stuck to cities ever since when creating my art. I figured I'd rather run into a human than whatever that thing was. The vanishing hitchhiker. The rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the highway ahead into a shimmering ribbon of asphalt. I peered through the downpour, my headlights cutting a swathe through the darkness. It was a lonely stretch of road, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever, with nothing but the occasional truck stop or abandoned gas station to break the monotony. I was driving home from a late-night shift at the diner, exhaustion tugging at my eyelids. As I rounded a bend, I noticed a figure standing on the shoulder, their thumb outstretched in the classic hitchhiker's pose. Normally, I wouldn't pick up a stranger, especially on a night like this, but something about the figure's silhouette, the way they stood hunched against the rain, tugged at my heartstrings. I slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road. As I rolled down the window, I could see that it was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, her clothes soaked through. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Can you give me a ride?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I've been walking for hours, and I'm freezing." I hesitated for a moment, but her desperation was palpable. "Sure, hop in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. She climbed in, her body trembling with cold. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with gratitude. "You're a lifesaver." "No problem," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road a ways," she replied, her voice vague. "Anywhere out of this rain." I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The rain continued to fall, the rhythmic swish of the wipers a hypnotic counterpoint to the rumble of the engine. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the occasional crackle of the radio. I glanced over at my passenger, taking in her appearance. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and delicate features. She wore a simple dress, now plastered to her skin by the rain. But there was something about her eyes, a haunted, distant look that sent a shiver down my spine. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Sarah." "I'm Michael," I said. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." She didn't respond, just continued to stare out the window at the rain-swept landscape. I tried to make conversation, asking her where she was from, where she was going, but her answers were evasive, almost cryptic. After a while, I gave up and focused on the road. The rain was starting to let up, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost 3 a.m. "We should be coming up on a town soon," I said. "There's a motel there where you can get a room for the night." Sarah didn't reply. I looked over at her, and my blood ran cold. She was gone, vanished. The passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet asphalt. I jumped out, frantically searching the surrounding area, but there was no sign of her. She had simply disappeared. I stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through my clothes, my mind reeling. Had I imagined her? Was I going crazy? I drove back to the diner, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I told my coworkers about what had happened, but they just laughed, dismissing it as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I knew what I had seen. I knew I had given a ride to a young woman, a woman who had vanished into thin air. Where did she go? And why did she choose me? The vanishing hitchhiker remains a mystery, A chilling reminder that there are still things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered by those who dare to venture into the unknown. The shadow in the shower. I want to share this story as a reminder to always trust your gut. Don't assume that just because you're in your own home and you get a strange feeling that you're just being paranoid. Several months ago, as autumn was approaching, I was home alone one evening. My roommate was out, and I was feeling a bit down with the shorter days and the onset of seasonal depression. I decided to have a lazy night in. I was on the couch browsing Netflix when I got this overwhelming feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just a feeling of unease, but more like something was out of place. It was a similar feeling to when you're driving and one of your tires is slowly deflating. Unable to shake this feeling, I got up, turned off the TV, and headed upstairs, leaving the lights on downstairs. Once upstairs, I turned on the hall light and went into the bathroom. I didn't feel like I was being watched, but I still felt this sense of intrusion. I put on some music and decided to take a shower, hoping to distract myself and shake off this feeling. If I had any pets, I would have checked on them to see how they were reacting, but I didn't. I could only rely on my own intuition, and I chose to ignore the feeling of unrest. As I was taking my clothes off, I thought I heard movement from downstairs. I needed my phone for a moment, but the noise didn't repeat. I figured I was either hearing things or my roommate had returned home early. It didn't occur to me that a stranger might have entered the house. I kept telling myself that all the doors were locked and that I lived in a safe neighborhood. I turned on the shower, finished undressing, and got in. The warm water helped, but it didn't completely calm my nerves. As soon as I turned off the water, the feeling of intrusion returned, and I suddenly felt the need to be very quiet. I carefully stepped out of the shower and turned off my phone. That's when I noticed it. A shadow under the crack of the door. Someone was standing just outside. The only thing between me and that person was a flimsy wooden door with a simple latch lock. I stared at the shadow, and panic finally set in. If it had been my roommate or a family member with a spare key, they would have knocked or announced themselves. I didn't even hear anyone breathing. A terrifying scenario flashed through my mind. Me opening the door and being attacked by a masked intruder. I slowly put on my clothes and just stared at the shadow, which remained motionless. After a moment, I made a decision. I slowly opened the bathroom window, flushed the toilet to mask any noise, and climbed out onto the roof. As I was sliding out, my head bumped against the blinds, making them rattle. I froze, and in that split second, I heard movement from outside the door. I slid across the roof and dropped to the ground. I picked myself up and sprinted across the lawn without looking back. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounded on the door until they let me in, and called the police. When the police arrived, they searched my house and found it empty. But in every room, there was evidence that someone had been rummaging through my belongings. The intruder had been wandering around while I was in the shower. Outside the living room window, they found DNA evidence indicating that he had been watching me while I was on the couch. This guy had been incredibly patient. He could have easily broken in and attacked me while I was in the shower, but he waited. I have no idea who he was or why he chose my house, but I do know that I will never ignore my gut feeling again. Please, everyone, be aware of your surroundings, play it safe, and never ignore your instincts. The unseen guests. This happened when I was around 11 years old. I was spending the summer at my dad's house, a single-story ranch-style home in a quiet cul-de-sac. I loved the privacy of his big fenced-in backyard, and during the warmer months, I enjoyed sleeping with my window open and a fan on. My dad usually worked late, so I was often home alone. I'd spend my time on his computer, using the dial-up internet. On this particular day, it was getting late, and I had been sitting for a while, so I decided to get up and make a snack. It was starting to get dark outside, but I didn't turn on any lights as I walked down the hallway to the kitchen. I used the light from the fridge to find something to make a sandwich with. Suddenly, I heard a familiar sound coming from my bedroom. It was the sound of the charms on my nightstand lamp tinkling. They would always make a soft chiming noise when I opened or closed my window, but I had never heard the sound from outside my room before. I froze, my senses heightened. I heard footsteps on the carpet in my room, some muffled voices, and the creak of my door opening. I quickly closed the fridge and rushed to the back door, but I hesitated. The back door led to a screened-in porch, then to the fenced-in yard. Going through the screen door would make too much noise, and whoever was in the house would probably catch me before I could unlock the gate and escape. I would have to run towards the intruders to get to the front door. Not knowing what else to do, I ducked into a small closet next to the fridge. There was barely enough room for me to stand, and I knew I was trapped if they opened the door. I held the doorknob to keep it closed. I heard 2 sets of footsteps walking down the hallway, and then someone was in the kitchen. He wasn't even trying to be quiet. He was just rummaging through the cabinets and drawers like he owned the place. I heard him open the fridge right next to me and knock some things around. "What the hell are you doing?" An annoyed voice came from the hallway.
I am starving, ma'am.
"I haven't eaten all day," the second voice replied. "Get the expletive out of there," the first voice snapped. The fridge door slammed shut, and then there was a tug on the handle of the closet I was hiding in. I tensed up and held the door latch firm. "Hey, this one's locked," the voice said from right outside the door. I knew I was caught and mentally prepared myself for the worst. "There's someone out back," the second voice said from the back door. It must have run out back. I heard both intruders run out to the back porch. I could have made a run for it then, but I was shaking so badly that I didn't trust myself to move. I thought about grabbing the cordless phone, but then I remembered the dial-up internet was using the phone line. After a few moments, the 2 men ran back into the house and headed for the front door. I heard the door unlock and swing open. They hadn't been out of the house for more than 5 seconds before I heard a police siren wailing as it drove past. It turned out that my neighbor had spotted the 2 men walking around outside and called the cops as soon as she saw them opening my window. They were just kids, really. One was 18, and the other was 19. My dad arrived home shortly after, and we ended up staying at my aunt's house for the night. I was incredibly shaken for days. The smallest noises made me anxious, and I was too afraid to be alone. Looking back, those 2 kids probably would have run away if they had found me. They didn't even have any weapons. But at the time, I didn't know that, and the experience was traumatizing for my 11-year-old self. Who would have thought that on a quiet cul-de-sac, with houses all around and the sun not even fully set, that my house would be invaded? The city may have been noisier, but at least it felt safer at the time. The graveyard shift. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed above, casting long shadows across the aisles of the deserted supermarket. It was another graveyard shift, another night of stocking shelves and scanning barcodes. But tonight, something felt different. A chill hung in the air, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that warned me I wasn't alone. My name is Alex, and I've been working the night shift at PriceSmart for the past year. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of time to think. I've always been a bit of a loner, content in my own company, so the solitude of the graveyard shift doesn't bother me. In fact, I kind of enjoy it. But tonight, the silence was unnerving. Every creak of the shelves, every rustle of a plastic bag sent shivers down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the unease persisted. I was stocking the cereal aisle when I first saw it, a shadow, moving quickly across the far end of the aisle. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my eyes, trying to peer through the darkness, but the shadow was gone. I continued stocking the shelves, but my senses were on high alert. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. I moved on to the frozen food section, the chill of the open freezers adding to the growing sense of unease. As I reached for a box of frozen pizzas, I heard a noise behind me, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But again, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I could feel eyes on me, following my every move. I hurried through the rest of my tasks, eager to finish my shift and get out of there. As I was locking up the front doors, I glanced at the security monitors, and that's when I saw it. The figure, tall and gaunt, stood at the far end of the store, its face obscured by the shadows. It was watching me, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I managed to get the door unlocked and sprinted out into the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, desperate to get away. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the supermarket. The figure was still there, standing in the doorway, its eyes fixed on me. I never went back to PriceSmart. I quit my job the next day, unable to shake the memory of that night, of the chilling feeling of being watched, of the figure in the shadows. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I can see it again, those glowing eyes staring at me, reminding me that there are some things in this world that are best left unseen, some secrets that are better left undisturbed. The house in the hills. My friends and I live in the hills of Dungiven, Northern Ireland. One day last year, the four of us were walking along the cliffs by the seaside, arguing about Conor McGregor, when my friend pointed out a row of power lines running up from the road and into the trees. We had been banned from our usual pub the night before, so we had some time to kill. With nowhere better to be, we decided to follow the power lines and see where they led. The area was rugged, and the closest thing to a road was a pair of tire tracks from some vehicle. But they were no longer attached to poles. They snaked through the tree branches, which I had never seen before. My friend wandered deeper into the trees and discovered a 6-foot-tall wire fence encircling a small clearing. Inside the clearing was a 2-story stone house. We circled the fence until we found the gate, which was hanging open. We walked right up to the front door, feeling a bit like trespassers. I hesitated in the entryway, but my friends immediately went inside to explore. I went to close the door behind me and noticed 4 deadbolts on the inside frame. I suddenly had a very strong feeling that we shouldn't be there. One of my friends found a metal detecting wand in the kitchen, like the ones used by airport security. In a back room, another friend found 2 backup generators. Despite the generators, it was obvious that the power hadn't been working in the house for a while. The whole place smelled musty, like the forest had invaded it. I wondered if it was a secret military base, but one of my friends pointed out that there were no weapon cabinets or checkpoints outside. I wanted to leave, but the others decided to go upstairs. Upstairs was one giant room with a cot in the corner and a long table with chairs. A flat-screen TV was mounted on the wall, presumably to view footage from the security cameras outside. While the others searched through drawers, my friend Eamon started messing with the TV like he was going to take it. I was getting impatient and wanted to leave. I had a feeling that this was some paranoid person's hideout and that they might have left in a hurry. I looked out the window at the view of the sea through the trees, and then I turned to go downstairs. That's when I froze. There were black marks, like ash, staining the carpeted stairs halfway up. They hadn't been there when we came up. Whoa, wait, how? I said aloud. Then the smell hit me. It was a burning fabric smell, and I started coughing and panicking. I rushed down the stairs, keeping close to the sides, and went straight out the front door. My friends followed, also commenting on the burning smell. I asked if anyone had tracked the ash on the stairs, but I already knew the answer. None of us had. I suddenly had the horrifying thought that someone else had been in the house with us the whole time. We left the area and headed back to the coast. Halfway back, we heard a loud roar from behind us. Could have been an animal, but it sounded angry. I didn't want to be involved anymore, but a couple of my friends went back a few days later. They told me that there was a burned spot outside the entrance to the stone house, and when they dug through the soil, they found an entire Ouija board. Later, I talked to another friend about it, and he said he had heard rumors of a group of psychotic people living in those woods. They believed in curses and demonic possession and were known to be violent towards outsiders. I don't know what was going on in that house, but I feel like we were lucky to escape without encountering anyone. Fear Fair. I used to work as a haunted house technician at Busch Gardens in Williamsburg, Virginia. During September and October, the park would host an event called Hallowscream, transforming into a massive Halloween-themed experience with multiple haunted attractions. The haunted house I worked at was called Fear Fair, a maze that wound through several buildings and tents. My job was to maintain the maze and fix anything that broke throughout the night. Guests would sometimes punch the decorations or trip and knock things over, so I was kept pretty busy. One Saturday evening, there was a heavy downpour, which discouraged most visitors. I used the downtime to work on the wooden frame at the entrance of the maze. I put up a sign that said the maze was temporarily closed and got to work. After a few minutes, I left to get a tool from the maintenance shed. When I returned, I saw someone strolling down the maze tunnel. It was a young man, maybe in his late teens, with a dark complexion, long braids, and a dark blue tank top. He had to have passed the sign to get in, so I was annoyed that he was trespassing. I was also worried he might get hurt because I had disassembled part of the wall. "Sir, we're not open yet," I called out. "Did you need help with something?" He jumped when he heard me and turned around. He gave me a strange look, like he was sizing me up. For a moment, I thought he might try something, but instead, he said, "No, I just thought you were open now." I explained that Fear Fair would reopen shortly after I finished my repairs. He nodded and walked past me without making eye contact. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and assumed he was just impatient. After I finished assembling the entryway, I took the sign down and started preparing the maze. The scare actors arrived and took their positions, but there weren't many guests that night because of the rain. Shortly after 9 p.m., one of the actors approached me. "Hey," he said. "I didn't want to say anything over the radio, but there's a guy with braids and a tank top back in the corridor behind the maze. I don't recognize him, and I don't know why he's there." I immediately remembered the trespasser from earlier and went to the back corridor. I turned on the lights and searched for any place where someone could hide, but I didn't see anyone. I locked the back door and walked through the maze, telling the scare actors they could leave. I turned off the fog machines and switched on the overhead lights to get a better look around. It wasn't unusual for drunk guests to wander off, but if this was the same guy I had seen before, I was worried he might be stalking someone. It was unnerving walking through the empty maze, filled with creepy mannequins, trying to find someone who might not even be there. The silence made it even worse because I started to question if the faint sounds I heard were real or just my imagination. After 15 minutes, I decided the maze was empty and started shutting off everything behind me as I walked back towards the entrance. Just as I had switched off another set of lights, I heard footsteps coming from across the room, heading straight towards me. I turned on my flashlight and saw the same guy from before charging at me with a prop mallet. When the light hit his face, he slowed down, stunned, and I took the opportunity to run. I knew the maze well and could navigate it in the dark. I could hear him cursing and bumping into things behind me as I ran. Once I exited the maze, I waved down the security guards who called the police. The police arrived and went into the maze. They emerged a few minutes later with the guy in handcuffs. He had surrendered peacefully and almost looked relieved. The police told me that this was a common initiation ritual for a local gang. The new recruit had to sneak into the park, find a weapon and a place to hide, record themselves knocking someone out, and then leave the park through the front gate. The mallet may have been a prop, but it was still made of wood and could have done some serious damage. If he hadn't been so obvious with his attack, I would never have seen it coming. After they took him away, the police searched the park and found 2 more young men hiding and waiting to attack someone. None of this ever made the news. I guess the park didn't want the bad publicity. Ever since then, I've made it mandatory for employees to travel in pairs when walking through the attractions after hours. The gathering in the darkness. This happened a few years ago. I was at home with my brother, Marcus. It was a dark evening, and I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard a knocking sound on the front porch. It wasn't a normal knock, like someone wanting me to answer the door. It was more like a few taps near one of the front windows. I glanced towards the front of the house, but all I could see in the windows were reflections of the living room. I waited, but the sound didn't come again, so I shrugged it off and went back to cooking. About 5 minutes later, the tapping sound repeated, this time from a different window. "Marcus," I called out, thinking it might be my brother. There was no response. I walked to the front of the house and peered outside, but I couldn't see anything. Marcus came downstairs. "Did you hear something from around back?" he asked. We paused and listened, and we heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside the dining room. "There's someone out there," I whispered, more angry than scared. We should have locked the doors and called the police, but I was young and headstrong. I grabbed my 9mm handgun from the gun cabinet. I knew how to handle it safely, having been raised around guns. "I'm going to scare him off," I told Marcus. I unlocked the front door and stepped onto the porch. Marcus turned on the outside lights. Standing about 8 feet in front of me was a thin guy wearing a hoodie. He had been about to step onto the porch, but when he saw me, he turned and ran. I chased after him for a few yards, then stopped, pointed the gun in the air, and fired a shot. "That's right. Expletive off," I yelled. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before turning back towards the house. That's when I saw them. There were at least 8 other people standing around my porch, and a few more scattered around the yard. They were mostly men, but there were also a couple of women. They were all dressed in dark clothes, and they just stared at me. I couldn't tell if any of them had weapons. Then they all scattered. Some jogged away, but most just walked off in different directions. I was so stunned that I forgot I was holding a gun for a moment. I ran back inside and locked the door. I had no idea what to tell Marcus. I had just fired a gun, and none of them had reacted in any way. If they had been drunk or trying to prank us, they would have said something. But they just stared at me like I had ruined their plan. Marcus turned on all the lights and called the police. When the police arrived, they found footprints everywhere, but they didn't seem to take the situation seriously. They asked if the strangers had threatened us, and I had to admit that they hadn't. They confiscated the gun, but they eventually returned it. To this day, I have no idea what those people were doing that night. My brother thinks they were part of a cult, and maybe we were going to be sacrifices. I thought they might have been planning to rob us, but saw the gun and ran. But that doesn't explain the silence. None of them made a sound. It was like they were all hypnotized. That group of people never returned, and I haven't seen anyone I recognize from that night in town. We got a dog not long after. The old hospital on the hill. The wind howled through the broken windows of the abandoned hospital, a mournful symphony echoing through the decaying corridors. Rain lashed against the crumbling facade, the storm clouds mirroring the darkness that clung to this forsaken place. I, an urban explorer with a penchant for the macabre, stood at the entrance, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, ready to document the secrets hidden within these crumbling walls. The old hospital had a sinister reputation. Locals whispered tales of patients who had disappeared without a trace, of doctors who performed unspeakable experiments, of screams that echoed through the empty halls at night. I, of course, dismissed these stories as mere folklore, but as I stepped across the threshold, a shiver ran down my spine, a premonition of the horrors that awaited me. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and disinfectant, a pungent combination that assaulted my nostrils. The walls were stained with mildew, the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The floors were littered with broken glass and rusted medical equipment, the remnants of a bygone era. I moved cautiously through the deserted hallways, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. I entered a patient room, its bed stripped bare, the mattress stained and torn. A rusty 4-stand stood sentinel beside the bed, its empty bag swaying gently in the breeze. I imagined the patients who had occupied this room, their suffering etched into the very walls. As I moved deeper into the hospital, I began to notice strange occurrences. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. Whispers seemed to emanate from the empty rooms, and I could have sworn I felt cold hands brush against my skin. I tried to rationalize these phenomena, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with every step I took. I entered the operating theater, its rusted instruments gleaming ominously in the dim light. A surgical table stood in the center of the room, stained with what I could only imagine were the remnants of countless procedures. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. As I turned to leave, I noticed a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a blood-stained surgical gown. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and lifeless. I gasped, stumbling back against the operating table. The figure raised a skeletal hand, beckoning me closer. "Join us," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo from beyond the grave. "We need your help." I shook my head, fear paralyzing me. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure advanced, its footsteps silent and deliberate. I knew I had to escape. I lunged for the door, pushing past the figure and into the hallway. I could hear its footsteps behind me, its presence growing stronger with every step I took. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I burst through doors, scrambled over overturned furniture, and dodged through crumbling archways. But the figure was always close behind, its relentless pursuit driving me to the brink of madness. Finally, I stumbled upon a staircase leading to the roof. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my hope renewed with every step. I burst through the door onto the roof, the wind and rain whipping at my face. But my relief was short-lived. The figure stood at the edge of the roof, its arms outstretched, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. "There's nowhere left to run," it whispered. "Join us." I knew I had no choice. I closed my eyes and jumped. The fall was short, but the impact was jarring. I lay on the wet pavement, my body aching, my mind reeling. I had escaped the hospital, but the memory of that night, of the figure in the operating theater and its chilling invitation, would forever be etched in my mind. I never explored another abandoned hospital again. The experience had taught me a valuable lesson, that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within their decaying walls. And I knew that the old hospital on the hill would forever stand as a testament to the darkness that can lurk within the human soul. A chilling reminder that some wounds never truly heal. The woman on the floor. This happened to me when I was 12 years old. I was riding my bike around my neighborhood when I saw a woman crying on the floor of her porch. The front door was wide open, so I stopped to see if she was okay. She told me that she was having problems with her husband and asked me to come inside to keep her company. I was hesitant, but she insisted that she just needed someone to talk to. I agreed to stay outside with her on the porch. She went inside and brought out some pictures of her son and husband. She told me how much she loved them and how worried she was that she would lose them if she and her husband got a divorce. She started crying again, and I felt bad for her. She kept calling me a nice boy and saying things like, "You have no idea how important it is to spend your time with me." She offered to make me dinner if I came inside, but I declined. I told her that I had to go, and she asked me if I knew how to turn on a cell phone. She had just gotten her first one and didn't know how to use it. I agreed to help her, and she went inside to get her phone. I waited on the porch, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. She finally came back with her phone, and I showed her how to turn it on and check her text messages. There was only one message from her husband. She asked me to read it to her. I opened the message, and it said, "Stop messaging me. You're psycho. Leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and gotten a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested." I was shocked. I realized that all of the messages she had been showing me were from her, not her husband. I told her that I couldn't read any more messages and that I had to go. She got angry and told me to keep reading. I refused, and she started to cry again. I felt bad for her, but I knew that I had to leave. I rode my bike home as fast as I could. I didn't tell my parents what had happened because I was afraid they would be angry with me for talking to a stranger. A few days later, I came home from school to find 3 police cars in front of my house. I asked my parents what was going on, and they told me that there had been a break-in at our neighbor's house. I later found out that the woman I had met was the one who had broken into the house. She had been harassing her ex-husband and his son, and she had broken into their house to try to get them back. I was so relieved that I hadn't gone inside her house that day. I could have been in danger. This experience taught me to always trust my gut instinct. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The thrift store stalker. This happened when I was 19. I was at a thrift store, browsing for picture frames, and I noticed this guy staring at me. He was in his 30s or 40s, and he had this really creepy grin on his face. I tried to ignore him, but he just kept staring. I started to get really uncomfortable, so I decided to leave. As I was walking to the checkout, I noticed that he was following me. I started to panic, but I didn't want to make a scene. I got in line and pretended to be on my phone, but I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He was still staring at me. I finally got to the front of the line and paid for my stuff. As I was leaving the store, I saw him walking towards the parking lot. I started to run, and he chased after me. I was so scared that I didn't know what to do. I finally made it to my car and locked the doors. He stood outside for a few minutes, staring at me, but then he finally left. I was so shaken up that I could barely drive home. I kept thinking about what would have happened if he had caught me. I never went back to that thrift store again. The figure in the cornfield. This happened when I was in college. I was driving home from visiting my friend Justin, who lived about an hour away. It was late at night, and I was driving through a rural area. The road was dark and deserted, and I was starting to get sleepy. I decided to pull over and take a nap. I found a secluded spot on the side of the road and parked my car. I rolled down the windows to get some fresh air and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept, but I suddenly woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my window. I opened my eyes and saw a man standing outside my car. He was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I rolled down the window and asked him what he wanted. "I just wanted to know if you were okay," he said. "You looked like you were sleeping, and I wanted to make sure you weren't sick or anything." I thanked him and told him that I was fine. He nodded and turned to walk away. I watched him as he walked away, and I noticed that he was walking towards a cornfield. I thought that was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I rolled up my window and closed my eyes again. I was about to go back to sleep when I heard something rustling in the cornfield. I opened my eyes and saw the man again. He was standing in the cornfield, staring at me. I was starting to get scared, so I started my car and drove away. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the man still standing in the cornfield, watching me as I drove away. I never saw him again, but I've never forgotten that night. I still wonder who he was and what he wanted. The midnight visitor. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, its rhythmic beat the only sound in the otherwise silent house. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, my mind racing with anxieties and worries. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. I pulled the covers tighter around me, seeking a sense of security in the darkness. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside my room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened intently, but the sound was not repeated. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but a knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I got out of bed and crept to the door, my bare feet silent on the carpet. I pressed my ear against the cool wood, listening for any further sounds, but there was nothing. I cautiously opened the door a crack, peering into the darkened hallway. The only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could see nothing out of the ordinary. I took a step out into the hallway, my hand trailing along the wall for support. As I moved towards the living room, I heard another sound, a soft, muffled thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. My heart leaped into my throat. I quickened my pace, my fear growing with every step. I reached the living room and flicked on the light switch. The room was empty, but as I scanned the familiar surroundings, I noticed something out of place. A vase, normally perched on the mantelpiece, lay shattered on the floor, its contents scattered across the carpet. I knelt down, carefully gathering the broken pieces, my mind racing. Had someone broken into the house? But there was no sign of forced entry, no other indication of an intruder. As I picked up the last shard of glass, I noticed something else, a small, white card lying on the floor beneath the mantelpiece. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. The card was blank, except for a single word scrawled across it in elegant cursive. Beware. A wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know what to make of the card, or the strange occurrences in the house. Was it a prank, a threat, or something more sinister? I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I kept replaying the events of the night in my mind, searching for an explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I called the police. They came and investigated, but found no evidence of forced entry or any other signs of foul play. They dismissed the incident as a possible break-in attempt, but I knew it was more than that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I became hyper-vigilant, checking the locks and windows obsessively, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Weeks turned into months, and the strange occurrences continued. Objects moved on their own. Whispers echoed through the empty rooms, and I would often catch glimpses of shadows flitting at the edges of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the fear persisted. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to venture out alone, afraid to sleep at night. One night, as I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, I heard a noise outside my window. I held my breath, listening intently. The noise came again, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails on glass. I slowly got out of bed and crept to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the blinds, but could see nothing in the darkness. Suddenly, the window shattered, shards of glass raining down on the floor. I screamed, stumbling back against the wall. A figure leaped through the broken window, landing silently on the carpet. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. But I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie red light. I knew then that my worst fears had been realized. I was not alone in the house. Something evil had found its way in, and it was coming for me. I turned and fled, the figure's footsteps echoing behind me. I ran through the house, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors. I could hear the figure gaining on me, its breathing ragged and heavy. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, my fingers trembling. I managed to get it open and stumbled out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting my face. But it was too late. The figure was upon me, its cold hands grasping at my throat. I struggled, but its grip was too strong. I felt my vision blurring, my lungs burning for air. Just as I thought I was about to lose consciousness, I heard a sound, a distant siren, growing closer. The figure hesitated, its grip loosening slightly. I took my chance, kicking out with all my might. My foot connected with its groin, and the figure doubled over in pain. I wrenched myself free and ran, stumbling down the porch steps and into the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the streetlights, where I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights illuminating the night. They searched the house, but found no sign of the intruder. The broken window and the shattered vase were the only evidence that something had been there. I never went back to that house. I sold it as soon as I could, eager to escape the memories of that night. But the experience left its mark on me. I'm still wary of the dark, still jump at every creak and groan of my new apartment. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I can hear those footsteps again, that heavy breathing, reminding me that there are some things in this world that we can't explain, some terrors that lurk just beyond the veil of our understanding. The disappearing roommate. This is a story about my old college roommate, Sarah. We were both attending a small liberal arts college in the Northeast. Sarah was a bit of a free spirit, always up for an adventure, and she had a quirky habit of disappearing for days at a time without any explanation. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were both young and independent, and I figured she was just exploring the area or visiting friends. But as time went on, her disappearances became more frequent and more mysterious. She would vanish for days, sometimes even weeks, without a word. When she returned, she would be evasive about where she had been, offering vague explanations like, "Oh, I was just visiting family," or "I went on a road trip with some friends." I tried to press her for more details, but she would always shut down, becoming defensive and withdrawn. I started to worry about her, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to invade her privacy, but I also didn't want her to get hurt. One day, Sarah disappeared for a particularly long time. I hadn't heard from her in over a month, and I was starting to get really worried. I decided to call her parents, but they hadn't heard from her either. I was starting to think that something terrible had happened to her when she suddenly reappeared one day, as if nothing had happened. She was acting strangely, though. She was more withdrawn than usual, and she seemed to be avoiding me. I tried to talk to her about it, but she wouldn't open up. I started to feel like I was losing my friend, and I didn't know what to do. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a noise coming from Sarah's room. It sounded like she was packing a bag. I got out of bed and went to her door. I knocked, but there was no answer. I opened the door and peeked inside, but the room was empty. I went back to my room and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got out of bed again and went to the window. I looked out and saw Sarah walking down the street, carrying a suitcase. I watched her as she walked away, and I wondered where she was going. I had a feeling that I would never see her again. The next day, I went to the police and reported Sarah missing. They searched for her, but they never found any trace of her. I still think about Sarah sometimes, and I wonder what happened to her. I hope that she's okay, but I have a feeling that I'll never know the truth. The stalker in the parking garage. This happened a few years ago when I was living in a large apartment complex in the city. I had just gotten home from work late one night and was exhausted. I parked my car in the underground parking garage and took the elevator up to my floor. As I was walking down the hallway to my apartment, I noticed a man walking behind me. He was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I realized that he was following me. I started to walk faster, and he sped up too. I started to get really scared, so I started to run. He ran after me. I finally made it to my apartment door and fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door open. He was right behind me. I finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I could hear him pounding on the door, trying to get in. I was so scared that I didn't know what to do. I called the police, and they arrived a few minutes later. They arrested the man and took him away. I was so shaken up that I could barely sleep that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if he had caught me. I never saw him again, but I've never forgotten that night. I'm still grateful to the police for saving me. The man in the woods. This happened when I was about 10 years old. I was playing in the woods behind my house with my friends, Jake and Emily. We were having a great time, running around and exploring. We were deep in the woods when we came across a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a man sitting on a rock. He was a strange-looking man with long, greasy hair and a beard. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and jeans, and he had a backpack next to him. We were a little scared of him, but we were also curious. We decided to go up to him and say hello. "Hi," I said. The man looked up at us and smiled. "Hello," he said. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked. "I'm just enjoying the woods," the man said. "It's a beautiful day." We talked to the man for a few minutes, and then we decided to go back to playing. We were about to leave the clearing when the man said, "Wait." We turned around and looked at him. "Can I ask you a favor?" he said. "Sure," I said. "Can you go get me some water?" he said. "I'm really thirsty." We looked at each other. We didn't want to leave the man alone, but we also didn't want to go get him water. "We'll be right back," I said. We ran back to my house and told my mom about the man. She told us to stay away from him and called the police. The police came and arrested the man. Turned out that he was a wanted criminal. We were so glad that we had listened to our gut instinct and gone back to my house. We could have been in danger. This experience taught me to always be aware of my surroundings and to never talk to strangers. The fog. The fog rolled in slowly, a silent, insidious blanket that enveloped the coastal town of Oakhaven. It started as a wispy haze, clinging to the shoreline, but soon thickened into an impenetrable curtain, obscuring the familiar landmarks and casting an eerie silence over the streets. I was working the late shift at the local diner, the only employee left besides Old Man Finnegan, the owner. He was dozing in his usual booth by the window, a newspaper spread out before him, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. The diner was deserted, the usual clatter of plates and chatter of customers replaced by an unsettling stillness. I glanced out the window, my unease growing with the encroaching fog. It was thicker than I'd ever seen it, swirling and shifting like a living entity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something unnatural about this fog. Suddenly, the bell above the door chimed, announcing a customer. I looked up, expecting to see a familiar face, a local straggler seeking a late-night coffee or a bite to eat. But the figure that stepped through the door was unlike any I had ever seen before. It was tall and slender, its form shrouded in the swirling fog. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a long scarf, but I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie yellow light. It moved with an unnatural grace, its footsteps silent on the worn linoleum floor. A shiver ran down my spine. I had never seen anything like it before. It was as if it had stepped out of a nightmare, a creature of darkness and fog. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't reply. It just stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on me, its presence filling the diner with an oppressive sense of dread. Old Man Finnegan stirred in his booth, his eyes fluttering open. He peered at the figure through his thick glasses, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Who are you?" he croaked, his voice raspy with sleep. The figure remained silent. It took a step closer, its form shifting and swirling like the fog that clung to it. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Get out!" Finnegan shouted, his voice surprisingly strong. "Get out of my diner!" The figure didn't react. It continued to advance, its glowing eyes fixed on us, its presence growing stronger with every step it took. I knew we were in danger. I grabbed a heavy coffee pot from behind the counter, my knuckles white around the handle. Finnegan reached for the old shotgun he kept under the counter, his hands shaking with age and fear. The figure stopped just short of the counter, its form solidifying slightly. I could see its face now, pale and gaunt, with sharp, predatory features. Its mouth opened in a silent snarl, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. I raised the coffee pot, ready to strike. Finnegan leveled the shotgun, his finger trembling on the trigger. But before either of us could act, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had dissolved into the fog that filled the diner. We stood there for a long moment, our hearts pounding in our chests, the silence deafening. Then, slowly, the fog began to recede, revealing the familiar streets and buildings of Oakhaven. The sun rose, casting a warm glow over the town, dispelling the darkness and the fear that had gripped us. But the memory of that night, of the creature in the fog, remained. We never spoke of it again, but I knew that Finnegan had seen it too, and I knew that we had been lucky to escape with our lives. The fog returned to Oakhaven many times over the years, but we never saw the creature again. But I know that it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next fog to roll in, waiting to claim its next victims. The black-eyed children. This happened about 5 years ago. I was living in a small town in the Midwest. I was home alone one night when I heard a knock on the door. I looked out the peephole, but I didn't see anyone there. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I heard another knock on the door. This time, I decided to answer it. I opened the door, and there were 2 children standing on my porch. They were both about 10 years old, and they were both wearing black clothes. The children had pale skin and dark, black eyes. They looked up at me and smiled. "Can we come in?" one of the children asked. I was a little hesitant, but I said, "Sure." The children came inside, and I closed the door behind them. "What are your names?" I asked. "I'm David, and this is my sister, Sarah," one of the children said. "It's nice to meet you," I said. "What brings you here?" "We're lost," David said. "Can you help us find our way home?" I felt sorry for the children, so I agreed to help them. "Where do you live?" I asked. "We don't know," Sarah said. "We just moved here. Do you know your address?" I asked. "No," David said, "but we know our phone number." I asked the children for their phone number, and they told me. I called the number, but it was disconnected. I was starting to get suspicious. I asked the children if they knew their parents' names. "No," Sarah said, "but we know our grandparents' names." I asked the children for their grandparents' names, and they told me. I called the grandparents, but they said they didn't have any grandchildren. I was starting to get really scared. I didn't know what to do. I told the children that I needed to go to the bathroom, and I went upstairs. I called the police and told them about the children. The police arrived a few minutes later, and they arrested the children. It turned out that they were escaped mental patients. I was so glad that I had called the police. I could have been in danger. This experience taught me to never let strangers into my house, no matter how innocent they seem. The Vanishing Man. This happened a few years ago when I was working as a security guard at a large office building. It was a quiet night, and I was making my rounds, checking all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. As I was walking down one of the hallways, I noticed a man standing at the end of the hall. He was tall and thin with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I didn't recognize him, so I approached him and asked if he needed any help. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with a blank expression on his face. I started to feel uneasy, so I asked him again if he needed anything. He still didn't say anything. He just kept staring at me. I decided to call for backup, and I radioed the other security guard on duty. "I've got a suspicious person in the building," I said. "Can you come and assist me?" "I'm on my way," the other guard said. I kept my eye on the man while I waited for backup to arrive. He didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, staring at me. A few minutes later, the other guard arrived. We approached the man together. "Sir, can we see some identification?" I asked. The man didn't say anything. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He opened the wallet and showed us his driver's license. The name on the license was John Smith. "Thank you, Mr. Smith," I said. "Can you tell us why you're here?" John Smith didn't say anything. He just stared at us with a blank expression on his face. We started to feel really uneasy, so we decided to escort him out of the building. We walked him to the front door and watched as he walked away. We went back inside and checked the security cameras to see if we could find any footage of John Smith entering the building. But there was nothing there. It was like he had just appeared out of thin air. We never saw John Smith again, but we've never forgotten that night. We still wonder who he was and what he was doing in the building. The campground creature. This happened a few years ago when I was on a camping trip with my family. We were staying at a campground in the mountains. It was a beautiful night, and we were all sitting around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the woods. It sounded like something was walking through the trees. We all stopped talking and listened. The noise got closer and closer. We started to get scared, so we decided to go inside the tent. We zipped up the tent and huddled together, listening to the noise outside. The noise got closer and closer, and then it stopped right outside our tent. We were all terrified. We didn't know what was out there. We waited for a few minutes, but the noise didn't start again. We decided to peek outside the tent to see what was going on. We unzipped the tent a little bit and looked out. There was a large, dark figure standing outside our tent. It was tall and muscular with long, sharp claws. We were all so scared that we screamed and zipped the tent back up. We huddled together in the tent, terrified. We didn't know what to do. We waited for what felt like hours, but the creature didn't go away. Finally, we decided to try to make a run for it. We unzipped the tent and ran out, screaming. The creature chased after us, but we were too fast for it. We made it back to our car and drove away. We never went camping again. The abandoned mine. The entrance to the abandoned mine gaped like a toothless maw. The rusted rails leading into the darkness, a chilling invitation to the unknown. I, a photographer with a fascination for forgotten places, stood at the threshold, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, eager to capture the haunting beauty of this relic of a bygone era. The old mine had a troubled history. Locals whispered tales of miners who had been swallowed by the earth, of strange lights and eerie sounds emanating from the depths, of a darkness that clung to those who dared to venture within. Of course, dismissed these stories as mere superstition. But as I stepped into the cool, damp air of the mine shaft, a shiver ran down my spine, a premonition of the horrors that awaited me. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the rough-hewn walls and the decaying timbers that supported the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and minerals, a pungent aroma that spoke of the mine's long-forgotten past. The silence was absolute, broken only by the echoing drip of water from the ceiling. I followed the rusted rails deeper into the mine, my camera clicking away, capturing the haunting beauty of the decaying machinery and the crumbling walls. The darkness seemed to press in on me, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the old mine. As I ventured further into the depths, I began to notice strange occurrences. The temperature dropped noticeably, a chill that seeped into my bones despite my warm clothing. I could hear faint whispers echoing through the tunnels, voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And I could have sworn I saw shadows moving at the edges of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished as quickly as they appeared. I tried to rationalize these phenomena, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with every step I took. I reached a large cavern, its walls lined with veins of glittering ore. The sight was breathtaking, a testament to the mine's former glory. But as I admired the natural beauty, I noticed something else, or a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the cavern. It was tall and skeletal, its form barely visible in the dim light. But I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie green fire. It raised a bony hand, beckoning me closer. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. It began to advance, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence filling the cavern with an aura of dread. I knew I had to escape. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the tunnels as the figure pursued me relentlessly. I could hear its skeletal feet scraping against the rock, its ragged breathing growing closer with every step. I dodged through narrow passageways, scrambled over piles of rubble, and slid down crumbling slopes. But the figure was always close behind, its relentless pursuit driving me to the brink of madness. Finally, I stumbled upon a ladder leading to an upper level. I climbed the rungs as quickly as I could, my hope renewed with every step. I emerged into a smaller tunnel, its end blocked by a cave-in. I was trapped. The figure appeared at the foot of the ladder, its eyes burning into me with malevolent intensity. It began to climb, its bony fingers gripping the rungs with unnatural strength. I knew I was no match for this creature of darkness. But as it reached the top of the ladder, I lunged forward, pushing it with all my might. The figure toppled backwards, falling into the darkness below with a sickening thud. I didn't wait to see if it was still alive. I turned and fled, scrambling over the rubble and back into the main tunnel. I didn't stop running until I reached the entrance of the mine, bursting out into the sunlight with a gasp of relief. I had escaped, but the memory of that night, of the figure in the cavern and its relentless pursuit, would forever be etched in my mind. I never explored another abandoned mine again. The experience had taught me a valuable lesson, that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within the earth. And I knew that the abandoned mine would forever stand as a testament to the darkness that can lurk in the forgotten corners of the world, a chilling reminder that some treasures are not meant to be found. The Hotel Stalker. This happened a few years ago when I was on a business trip. I was staying at a hotel in a big city. I had just checked in and was unpacking my suitcase when I heard a knock on the door. I opened the door, and there was a man standing in the hallway. He was tall and thin with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I didn't recognize him, so I asked him if he needed anything. "I'm looking for my friend," he said. "Have you seen him?" I told him that I hadn't seen his friend, and he thanked me and walked away. I closed the door and went back to unpacking my suitcase. A few minutes later, I heard another knock on the door. I opened the door, and there was the man again. "Have you seen my friend?" he asked. I told him that I hadn't seen his friend, and he thanked me and walked away. I closed the door and went back to unpacking my suitcase. A few minutes later, I heard another knock on the door. I opened the door, and there was the man again. "Have you seen my friend?" he asked. I was starting to get annoyed, so I told him that I hadn't seen his friend and that I didn't want to be disturbed again. He apologized and walked away. I closed the door and went back to unpacking my suitcase. A few minutes later, I heard another knock on the door. I opened the door, and there was the man again. "Have you seen my friend?" he asked. I was really angry now, so I yelled at him to go away. He looked surprised, and then he walked away. I closed the door and went back to unpacking my suitcase. I didn't hear any more knocks on the door that night, but I didn't get much sleep. I kept thinking about the man and his strange behavior. The next day, I went to the front desk and told the clerk about the man. The clerk told me that there had been several other guests who had complained about the man. The clerk said that the man had been banned from the hotel, but he kept coming back. I was glad to hear that the man had been banned from the hotel, but I was still worried. I didn't know what the man wanted, but I had a feeling that he was dangerous. I checked out of the hotel that day and went to stay with a friend. I never saw the man again, but I've never forgotten that night. I'm still grateful to the hotel clerk for warning me about him. The watcher in the window. This happened a few years ago when I was living in a house with my roommate, Ben. It was a cold winter night, and I was home alone, studying for an upcoming exam. Ben was out of town visiting his family. I was sitting at my desk in my bedroom, surrounded by textbooks and notes, when I suddenly felt a chill. I looked up and saw that the window was open. I got up and closed the window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anyone. I tried to ignore the feeling and went back to studying, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I got up and checked the window again, but it was still closed. I looked out the window again, but I still didn't see anyone. I tried to ignore the feeling and went back to studying, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I got up and checked the window again, but it was still closed. I looked out the window again, but I still didn't see anyone. I was starting to get really scared, so I decided to call the police. I told the police that I thought someone was watching me, and they said they would send someone over to check it out. I waited for the police to arrive, but they never did. I was starting to get really scared, so I decided to go to bed. I lay in bed trying to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about the feeling that someone was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside my window. I got up and looked out the window, and I saw a man standing in the backyard. He was tall and thin, with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I screamed and ran out of the room. I ran downstairs and out the front door. I ran to the nearest neighbor's house and pounded on the door. They answered the door, and I told them what had happened. They called the police, and the police arrived a few minutes later. The police searched the backyard, but they didn't find anyone. I went back to my house and locked all the doors and windows. I never saw the man again, but I've never forgotten that night. I'm still scared to be home alone at night. The ritual. The ancient stone circle stood silhouetted against the full moon, its weathered monoliths casting long, eerie shadows across the moor. A student of archaeology with a fascination for the occult stood at the entrance, my notebook and pen in hand, eager to witness the rumored pagan ritual that was said to take place on this night. The stone circle had a mysterious reputation. Locals whispered tales of strange lights and chanting voices emanating from the stones, of sacrifices made to appease ancient gods, of a power that could both heal and destroy. I, of course, was skeptical, but the allure of the unknown, the possibility of witnessing something truly extraordinary, was too strong to resist. As I approached the circle, a hush fell over the moor. The wind, which had been whipping through the tall grass just moments before, died down, leaving an unsettling silence. The only sound was the beating of my own heart. I stepped into the circle, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The stones loomed above me, their rough surfaces cold and imposing. I could feel a strange energy emanating from them, a tingling sensation that prickled my skin. Suddenly, a group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks. They moved with a fluid grace, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the chanting that now filled the air. They carried torches, their flames casting dancing shadows on the stones. I watched in fascination as they formed a circle around a large, flat stone in the center of the ring. One of the figures, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. He wore a mask that resembled a skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare directly at me. He raised his hands above his head, and the chanting intensified. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel the ground vibrate beneath my feet. The figure began to speak in a language I didn't recognize, his voice deep and resonant, filled with power. I strained to understand the words, but they were unintelligible. Yet I could sense their meaning, their intent. They were invoking something ancient and powerful, something that lay dormant beneath the earth. The figure lowered his hands, and the chanting reached a fever pitch. The ground shook violently, and a crack appeared in the flat stone in the center of the circle. A dark, viscous liquid began to ooze from the crack, its stench filling the air with a nauseating sweetness. The figures stepped back, their masks contorted in expressions of ecstasy and fear. The liquid pulsed and bubbled, forming a swirling vortex in the center of the stone. And then something emerged from the vortex. It was a creature of nightmares, its form shifting and changing, its eyes burning with an unholy light. It let out a deafening shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The figures prostrated themselves before the creature, their chanting reaching a crescendo. I, however, was frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to speak. The creature turned its gaze upon me, its eyes burning into my soul. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a sense of overwhelming dread. I knew that I was in the presence of something truly evil, something that defied all human understanding. The creature raised its hand, and a bolt of energy shot towards me. I screamed, throwing myself to the ground just as the energy struck the stone where I had been standing. The stone exploded, sending fragments of rock flying through the air. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the creature's shrieks echoing behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the road, where I collapsed, gasping for breath. I never went back to the stone circle. The memory of that night, of the ritual and the creature it had summoned, haunted me for years to come. And I learned a valuable lesson that night, that some mysteries are best left unsolved, some doors best left unopened. For there are forces in this world that we cannot comprehend, powers that can consume us if we dare to tamper with them. The haunting of Harmony Heights. Harmony Heights, a sprawling Victorian mansion perched atop a windswept hill, had a reputation. Locals whispered tales of restless spirits, unexplained noises, and chilling apparitions that haunted its darkened halls. I, a paranormal investigator with a healthy dose of skepticism, was intrigued. Armed with my trusty EMF reader and a camera, I arrived at Harmony Heights, ready to uncover the truth behind the legends. The house was imposing, its gables and turrets silhouetted against the twilight sky. Ivy clung to the weathered walls, and the windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to stare back at me with an unnerving intensity. As I approached the front door, a gust of wind slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the empty house like a ghostly sigh. I let myself in with the key the realtor had given me, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom of the entrance hall. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and a faint, floral perfume that seemed to linger in the shadows. I began my investigation in the parlor, a grand room with high ceilings and faded wallpaper. I set up my equipment, the EMF reader emitting a steady hum as it scanned for electromagnetic fluctuations. I wandered through the room, my camera capturing images of the ornate furniture and the cobweb-draped chandeliers. As I moved towards the fireplace, I noticed a cold spot, a distinct drop in temperature that sent a shiver down my spine. The EMF reader spiked, its needle swinging wildly. I snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the darkened corner of the room. And that's when I saw her, a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, materialized in the corner of the room. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with a deep sadness. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of longing and despair. I gasped, stumbling back against the wall. The EMF reader screeched, its alarm blaring through the silent house. I raised my camera, snapping another photo, but the woman had vanished. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the light? Or had I actually captured evidence of a ghostly presence? I continued my investigation, moving through the house room by room. In the library, I found books flying off the shelves, their pages rustling as if turned by unseen hands. In the dining room, I heard the clatter of silverware and the faint murmur of conversation, though I was alone in the house. And in the master bedroom, I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, a touch that sent shivers down my spine. The activity intensified as the night wore on. Doors slammed shut, objects moved on their own, and I could hear footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen entities, grew stronger with every passing hour. I reached the attic, the air thick with dust and the musty smell of forgotten memories. As I shone my flashlight around the cramped space, I noticed a trunk tucked away in a corner. Curiosity piqued, I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed lace and faded photographs, lay a doll. It was a porcelain doll, dressed in a tattered Victorian gown, its painted face frozen in an expression of malevolence. Its eyes, however, were what truly disturbed me. They were large and black, staring out at the world with a chilling intensity. As I reached for the doll, I felt a surge of energy, a wave of cold that washed over me. The attic door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I heard it, a child's laughter, echoing through the attic, chilling and unnatural. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing across the darkened space. But there was nothing there, just the old trunk, the creepy doll, and the echoing laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something truly evil, something that had been trapped within the walls of Harmony Heights for decades. I fled the attic, racing down the stairs and out of the house, the laughter echoing behind me. I never returned to Harmony Heights. The memory of that night, of the ghostly woman, the unexplained phenomena, and the chilling laughter in the attic haunted me for years to come. And I learned a valuable lesson that night, that some houses are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within their walls. For there are some places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, where the echoes of the past refuse to be silenced. The midnight game. This happened when I was about 13 years old. I was at a sleepover with a few friends. We were all in the basement watching a scary movie. It was getting late, and we were all starting to get tired. One of my friends suggested that we play a game called the Midnight Game. I had never heard of the Midnight Game before, but my friend explained the rules to us. It was a simple game, but it was also supposed to be very dangerous. The object of the game was to summon a demon into your home. To play the game, you needed a candle, a mirror, and a piece of paper with your name written on it. You had to start the game at exactly midnight. You had to light the candle and place it in front of the mirror. Then, You had to turn off all the lights in the house and stand in front of the mirror, holding the piece of paper with your name on it. You had to stare into the mirror and say your name 3 times. Then, you had to turn around and run away from the mirror. The demon would then chase you through the house. If the demon caught you, it would kill you. We were all a little scared, but we decided to play the game anyway. We waited until midnight and then we started the game. We lit the candle and placed it in front of the mirror. Then, we turned off all the lights in the house and stood in front of the mirror, holding the pieces of paper with our names on them. We stared into the mirror and said our names 3 times. Then, we turned around and ran away from the mirror. We ran through the house, laughing and screaming. We were all so scared, but we were also having a lot of fun. We ran into the living room, and we saw the demon standing there. It was a tall, dark figure with red eyes and sharp claws. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran into the kitchen, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran into the dining room, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran into the basement, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran upstairs, and we saw the demon standing there. We attic, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran back downstairs, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran out of the house, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran down the street, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and woods, and we saw the demon standing there. We screamed and ran away from the demon. We ran to the nearest neighbor's house and pounded on the door. They answered the door, and we told them what had happened. They called the police, and the police arrived a few minutes later. The police searched the woods, but they didn't find the demon. We went back to my friend's house and went to bed. We never played the midnight game again. The Shadow Man. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as I sped down the highway, the engine of my motorcycle roaring in defiance of the late hour. I was a night owl, a creature of the darkness, drawn to the solitude and mystery that cloaked the city after the sun went down. But on this particular night, my nocturnal adventures would take a terrifying turn, leading me on a desperate chase through the urban jungle, pursued by a shadow that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It started innocently enough. I was cruising down a deserted side street, enjoying the cool night air and the freedom of the open road, when I noticed a figure standing in the shadows of an alleyway. It was tall and slender, its form barely visible in the dim light, but I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie red light. Intrigued, I slowed down, pulling my motorcycle to the curb. I peered into the alleyway, trying to get a better look at the figure. But as I approached, it vanished, melting into the darkness like a phantom. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a homeless person seeking shelter from the night. But as I continued my ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and my heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, I saw the figure again, its silhouette stark against the streetlights. It was moving with an unnatural speed, gliding effortlessly over the pavement, its eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. I twisted the throttle, accelerating down the street, my heart pounding in my chest. But the figure kept pace, its form growing larger in the mirror. I could feel its presence closing in on me, its shadow stretching out like a long, dark finger. I weaved through traffic, taking sharp turns and running red lights, desperate to escape the pursuit of this spectral stalker. But it was no use. The figure was always there, its eyes burning into me, its presence growing stronger with every passing block. I raced down a deserted highway, the wind whipping through my hair, the engine roaring in protest. But the figure was still there, gaining on me. I could feel its icy breath on my neck, its presence suffocating me. I knew I had to do something drastic. I spotted an exit ramp and veered off the highway, my tires screeching as I navigated the sharp turn. I sped down a narrow side street, hoping to lose the figure in the maze of buildings and alleyways. But it was no use. The figure was relentless, its pursuit unwavering. I could hear its footsteps echoing behind me, its presence growing stronger with every passing moment. I reached a dead end, a brick wall looming before me. I had nowhere to go. I turned to face my pursuer, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure materialized from the shadows, its form now fully visible in the dim light. It was tall and skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its bones. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent red light, and its mouth was twisted into a cruel grin. I knew then that I was facing something beyond human comprehension, a creature of darkness that had stepped out of my nightmares and into the real world. The figure lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I screamed and closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the attack never came. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The street was empty, the only sound the gentle hum of the streetlights. I sat there for a long time, my body trembling, my mind reeling. I had escaped, but the memory of that night, of the Shadow Man and his relentless pursuit, would forever be etched in my mind. I never rode my motorcycle at night again, and whenever I find myself alone in the darkness, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure emerge from the shadows, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. For I know that the Shadow Man is still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for his next victim. And I pray that I will never be that victim, the woman in white. This happened a few years ago when I was driving home from work late one night. It was a dark and stormy night, and the rain was coming down hard. I was driving down a deserted highway when I saw a woman standing on the side of the road. She was wearing a white dress, and she was waving her arms. I pulled over to see if she needed help. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "I'm stranded. Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?" I told her that I could, and she got in the car. We drove for a few minutes in silence, and then the woman said, "I'm so grateful that you stopped to help me. I've been stranded here for hours." "No problem," I said. "I'm glad I could help." We drove for a few more minutes, and then the woman said, "I'm starting to feel a little sick. Can you pull over for a minute?" I pulled over to the side of the road, and the woman got out of the car. She walked over to the side of the road and started to throw up. I got out of the car and went over to her. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I think so," she said. "I just need a minute." She stood up and wiped her mouth. "Thank you for your help," she said. "I'm feeling better now." She got back in the car, and we continued on our way. We drove for a few more minutes, and then the woman said, "I'm starting to feel really sick. Can you take me to the hospital?" I turned the car around and headed for the nearest hospital. We arrived at the hospital and I helped the woman inside. The nurses took her to a room and I waited in the waiting room. A few minutes later, a doctor came out and told me that the woman had died. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that she had died. The doctor told me that the woman had been poisoned. I was horrified. I had no idea that she had been poisoned. The police came and questioned me. I'm still haunted by the memory of the woman in white, the hitchhiker. This happened a few years ago when I was driving home from a road trip. It was late at night, and I was driving through a rural area. The road was dark and deserted, and I was starting to get sleepy. I was thinking about pulling over and taking a nap when I saw a man standing on the side of the road, hitchhiking. I felt sorry for him, so I pulled over and offered him a ride. He got in the car, and I asked him where he was going. "I'm going to the next town," he said. I told him that I was going that way too, and we drove off. We talked for a while, and I learned that his name was Jack. He was a friendly guy, and we seemed to have a lot in common. We were about halfway to the next town when Jack said, "I'm starting to feel a little sick. Can you pull over for a minute?" I pulled over to the side of the road, and Jack got out of the car. He walked over to the side of the road and started to throw up. I got out of the car and went over to him. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I think so," he said. "I just need a minute." He stood up and wiped his mouth. "Thank you for your help," he said. "I'm feeling better now." He got back in the car, and we continued on our way. We drove for a few more minutes, and then Jack said, "I'm starting to feel really sick. Can you take me to the hospital? I turned the car around and headed for the nearest hospital. We arrived at the hospital and I helped Jack inside. The nurses took him to a room and I waited in the waiting room. A few minutes later, a doctor came out and told me that Jack had died. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that he had died. The doctor told me that Jack had been poisoned. I was horrified. I had no idea that he had been poisoned. The police came and questioned me, but I didn't have any information to give them. I never found out who Jack was or why he had been poisoned. I've never forgotten that night. I'm still haunted by the memory of the hitchhiker, the stalker in the rearview mirror. This happened a few years ago when I was driving home from a friend's house late one night. It was a dark and foggy night, and the visibility was poor. I was driving down a deserted road when I noticed a car following me. It was a black sedan, and it was driving very close behind me. I tried to ignore it, but the car continued to follow me. I started to get nervous, so I sped up. The car sped up too. I tried to lose the car, but it was no use. It was still following me. I was starting to get really scared, so I pulled over to the side of the road. The car pulled over behind me. I got out of my car and walked over to the other car. "Can I help you?" I asked. The driver of the other car rolled down his window. He was a man in his 40s with a dark beard and mustache. "I'm just following you," he said. "Why?" I asked. "I like to watch people," he said. I was horrified. I told him to go away and he drove off. I got back in my car and drove home. I was so shaken up that I could barely sleep that night. I never saw the man again, but I've never forgotten that night. I'm still scared to drive alone at night. The intruder next door. This happened a few years ago when I was living in an apartment complex. I was home alone one night when I heard a noise coming from the apartment next door. I listened closely, and I could hear someone moving around inside. I thought it was strange because I knew that my neighbor was out of town. I went over to the door and knocked, but there was no answer. I tried the doorknob and the door opened. I cautiously stepped inside the apartment. It was dark, and I couldn't see anything. I reached for the light switch and the lights came on. I looked around the apartment, but I didn't see anyone. I started to feel uneasy, so I decided to leave. As I was walking out the door, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, and I saw a man standing in the hallway. He was tall and thin with long, dark hair and a beard. He was wearing a black trench coat and a fedora. I screamed and ran out of the apartment. I ran down the hallway and out the front door. I ran to the nearest neighbor's house and pounded on the door. They answered the door, and I told them what had happened. They called the police, and the police arrived a few minutes later. The police searched the apartment next door, but they didn't find anyone. I went back to my apartment and locked all the doors and windows. I never saw the man again, but I've never forgotten that night. I'm still scared to be home alone at night.